is, and that is the issue to which we should address ourselves, and that is the issue which I have no hesitation in saying is unacceptable.
Thank you. That ends topical questions. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 8577 in the name of Joe McAlpine on the Burrell-Collection Lending and Borrowing Scotland Bill. Members who wish to speak in the debate should press the request to speak button now. And if I can indicate at the beginning of this debate that overall this afternoon we have a bit of time in hand, and we will make up for interventions by giving members more speaking time. So I call on Joe McAlpine to speak to move the motion on behalf of the Burrell-Collection Lending and Borrowing Scotland Bill Committee. Ms McAlpine, you've got 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my thanks to the clerks and the SPICE staff and my committee colleagues who helped scrutinise the bill, as well as everyone who gave evidence. The Burrell-Collection is an outstanding vision of international significance, and after careful consideration of the wide range of oral and written evidence, the committee is firm in its belief that the time has come to allow the collection to be seen by a wider audience. Indeed, I believe we have a duty to the people of Glasgow to promote the collection, which is a hidden treasure, and also a duty to the people of Scotland. When the Burrell-Collection opened in 1993, it had 1 million visitors a year. Sadly, today that figure has diminished dramatically, and it's now down to fewer than 250,000. As Dr Bridget McConnell pointed out in her evidence to the committee, the collection is still relatively unknown, both here and internationally, and amending the 1944 bequest to allow what will be a significant and probably a once-in-a-lifetime world tour will help raise awareness both at home and abroad. It is hoped that such a tour will also help facilitate future preservation of the collection by engaging with international communities, art institutions and research, conservation and mutually beneficial loans. I was impressed with the evidence that Sir Angus Grossart, one of Scotland's foremost art collectors, gave to the committee, and he has been very involved in advising Glasgow Life on their plans. He told us this is a chance, the tour, to engage with a wider range of institutions, including those to which we are not sending the loan exhibition. He spoke of the opportunities for scholarship and profile raising that can result from loan offers. In fact, wider engagement by the public, scholarship, conservation, fundraising, awareness raising, profile raising and tourism were all frequently cited as potential benefits that can accrue from lending. There is also the practical and very immediate problem that the building housing the collection is in urgent need of refurbishment and does not in its current condition provide a safe environment. The committee witnessed first-hand the regrettable condition of the building, which is strewn with tarpaulins to prevent further water ingress. Several exhibits have been removed from display to prevent water damage, and it's estimated that of the 9,000 items in the collection, only about 2,000 can be displayed at any one time. The prospect of the extra capacity which would be provided through refurbishment and the opportunity this would bring to display items currently inaccessible to the public is very welcome. As with any capital project, financial cost has figured significantly in discussions surrounding refurbishment. The promoters have argued that a tour of the Burrell-Collection could raise approximately £15 million of the estimated £45 million cost of refurbishment. While the committee is not fully convinced that it is possible to estimate revenue with any degree of certainty at this stage, we accept that a contribution is likely to be raised by promoting the collection globally. Whether that contribution will amount to £15 million, we are not convinced. However, I would like to emphasise a strong feeling that the issue at hand is not about raising money, but rather about raising the profile of the collection itself. This bill is not about judging Glasgow City Council and how much money they will spend in refurbishment. It's about the principle of lending and promoting the collection. It's indisputable that William Burrell was very much in favour of the principle of lending, and we know that he did wish to share the collection through loans. It was often pointed out during evidence sessions that Burrell himself was a considerable lender. The focus of the committee's decision has therefore not been on whether Sir William would have been in favour of lending his collection. We know that he was, but rather whether it is safe nowadays to lend outside Britain. In his will, Sir William stipulated that he would not allow any works to be loaned overseas. I would like to correct that. In the bequest in 1944, Sir William stipulated that he would not allow any of his works to be loaned overseas, because as a shipping magnate he was all too aware at that time of how the works he had collected might be damaged in transit. The argument put forward by Sir Peter Hutchison, the chair of the Burrell Trustees, that on the whole transportation is much safer than it used to be, and although risk cannot be eliminated, it can't be mitigated, that we found was a convincing argument. As a result, the committee was persuaded that it is sometimes appropriate to depart from the wishes of benefactors, particularly if the circumstances which have led them to adopt a certain position have changed. We have heard convincing arguments that Burrell wished to promote access to his collection as long as it was not placed in danger. The committee noted, however, valid concerns relating to the transportation of particularly fragile works such as pastels and textiles. Indeed, we were so concerned about this that we elected to take further evidence on the matter. Having taken further expert evidence on this, we concluded that decisions regarding the lending of certain items should be taken on a case-by-case basis. Crucially, the bill provides for the preparation of a lending code to be agreed by Glasgow City Council and the Burrell Trustees, setting out the basis upon which new powers for lending and borrowing would be exercised. This would offer another layer of protection for fragile items. The code should safeguard against excessive and over-commercial lending and against very fragile items being put at unreasonable risk. After an initial tour, lending decisions would be based primarily on scholarship and the opportunity for conservation. Moreover, the committee recognises that Glasgow Museums is an experienced lender and has an impressive record with regard to lending and borrowing a great number of items without making a single insurance claim, we were told in evidence. In recommending that this bill be passed, the committee and the Parliament are placing their trust in the promoter to take great care of the collection and to ensure that the refurbishment used as an argument in favour of the bill does indeed take place. Sir William Burrell was a pragmatic man. We have established that he was not against the principle of touring or lending and was very much in favour of the promotion of his collection. While Britain maybe have been at the centre of the world in many senses while Sir William lived, that is no longer reality, and the kind of museums that the promoters are talking about touring the collection to are indeed world class. By all accounts, the state of the building currently housing the collection is now critical, with an estimated refurbishment period of 4 years. The fact of the matter is that the collection must be moved somewhere. Under the terms of Burrell's own bequest, works can currently be moved around Great Britain. He therefore presumably accepted the risks inherent in the transportation of items. Taking this into account, along with the scientific and technological advances we heard in evidence, it seems reasonable to suggest that, on balance, Sir William Burrell would not be opposed to the principle of this bill. I therefore move this bill in my name.
Thank you, Ms McAlpine. I now call on Fiona Hislop. Ms Hislop, you've got 6 minutes, but we will be generous. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In my role as Cabinet Secretary for Culture and External Affairs, I want to offer some final thoughts on the provisions in this private bill and the impact it will have on the Burrell-Collection. As members will be aware, the Burrell-Collection is one of the most prominent and varied in Scotland. It is without doubt a collection of international significance in terms of the history of art and antiquities. The 9,000-strong collection was assembled by Sir William Burrell as he travelled widely around the world. In 1944, as we've heard, he gifted this remarkable collection to the City of Glasgow, along with the funds to erect a new building within which to house his treasures. Now, nearly 70 years after his bequest, this bill is aimed at securing the long-term sustainability of that building while looking at new ways to promote his collections to a wider audience, allowing more people to learn about and enjoy them than ever have before. And the bill has been considered by the committee and by the Parliament in the preliminary stage debate. Through much of these stages, it has been clear to me that the main concerns have been the very sensitive issue of overturning some of the express wishes of Sir William Burrell. Those concerns were in respect of what happens to the items he so carefully collected, some fragile and delicate, many priceless and irreplaceable. and the increased risk of harm that these items could be placed in if allowed to be loaned internationally to other institutions. The Parliamentary Committee, who scrutinised this bill, did a thorough job of considering these sensitive issues in their analysis of the evidence. They have weighed up the risks and opportunities offered by the bill. They have looked back at Sir William Burrell's lifetime in order to ask themselves what he might have done were he faced with the same questions today, in a world where science and technology are markedly different to what he would have known. The committee's analysis has led them to conclude that Burrell was a lender who wanted to share his collection with the people not just in Glasgow and Scotland, but further afield through loans within Great Britain. The preliminary debate did not find any fault with the committee's acceptance of the bill's proposals, and we are now at the final stage of passage of this bill. This government believes that increasing cultural participation can be done by maximising the number and range of people who see collections. Encouraging visits and the enjoyment of museums is a key aim of Scotland's national strategy for museums and galleries, and allowing lending from the Burrell-Collection is consistent with this aim. Lending from the collection and borrowing by the collection could only be done in agreement with the Burrell trustees on a case-by-case basis. A tour and lending of individual items would bring the collection to the attention of an international audience and enable people from all over the world to see and appreciate it, thus raising its profile and putting Glasgow and Scotland on an international stage. And in this, the year of homecoming, in this year where the eyes of the world are on Scotland for the Commonwealth Games and the Ryder Cup, it is an opportunity for all of Scotland's cultural institutions to build on their already impressive international image. The Burrell-Collection being able to lend in tours is an example of this. The bill, which will enable the collection to promote Scotland and raise awareness of the collection while the building is refurbished to display more of the 9,000 works of art that it holds. The committee report and plenary debate considered the risks to care and preservation posed by the prospect of international transportation of artworks. And the Bill Committee's meticulous report balanced these criticisms against the benefits that could be achieved by increasing access to the collection and raising the funds to support the restoration of the building. And it is worth noting that the evidence suggests that it is during packing and unpacking of items that damage occurs, something that would happen to an item being transported across Glasgow or to the other side of the world, or indeed if the item was being stored away while a building was refurbished. As I've said before, we can see from the massive success of the refurbished Scottish National Portrait Gallery and the National Museum of Scotland, and more specifically to Glasgow, the Kelvin Grove Museum refurbishment and the new Riverside Transport Museum, what can be achieved by investing in cultural institutions and bringing our museums up to date for the 21st century. It results in soaring visitor numbers and increased customer satisfaction. And given its significance, it seems only logical that the Burrell-Collection should be next. The Scottish Government thanks the Parliament for its consideration of the bill and supports its passage. And, Presiding Officer, I think with that intention I will bring my remarks to the close, but again put on record my thanks to the Bill Committee. It is one of the roles and responsibilities of this Parliament that is frequently unsung, but the private bills element of this committee is as much part of the democracy as the other elements of bills that are brought forward by committees or indeed government. And I thank the diligence and the duty demonstrated by the members of the committee under its stewardship by Joan McAlpine. Thank you.
Thank you. I now move to the open debate. Two members have indicated they wish to speak. To Mr MacDonald and Mr Griffin, the time is generous. You have a minimum of 4 minutes. Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before we pass the Burrell-Collection Lending and Borrowing Bill, I think it's important to highlight some of the concerns that members of the public still have with this bill and the refurbishment project. In relation to lending and borrowing, I can see the merits of being able to tour a small number of items on a one-off exhibition during the closure period. I also accept that lending or borrowing individual items may assist the interpretation or complement the collection. However, some people see it differently, and the following online comment expresses another view on the new lending and borrowing powers. Sir William's overriding concern was not that he did not want items sent overseas because he feared that they would be at risk during transportation. Rather, Sir William's overriding concern was that the collection was kept intact as a meaningful collection. The collection was a man's life work. The collection in its entirety told the story of the development of human civilization from ancient Egypt and China through to the works of the French Impressionists and the Glasgow Boys. The collection was to be his legacy because it represented his own unique view of human history, and he wanted people to understand that. The collection was how he would live on after he died, and to this end he tried to ensure that the collection would remain intact long after he was gone. Yep.
James Dornan.
Thank you for giving way. Does the member accept that, although William Burrell wanted the collection to be kept together and to be shown to the public, that the condition of the building just now is such that many items in that collection have never been shown to the public, and it may well be that one of the ways to deal with this is to, at the time that the building is being refurbished, to allow these items to be seen out with Scotland?
Gord MacDonald.
Yeah, I totally accept that. There are 9,000 items in the collection. About 2,000 are on display at any moment in time, and the collection hasn't been refreshed for a long number of years, so I do accept that point. Regardless of what Sir William Burrell's reasons were for not wanting the collection to tour, we as a committee have accepted the need for change. However, there are issues relating to the Burrell Gallery refurbishment that can be addressed by Glasgow City Council to alleviate some of the other concerns. The Council should outline how they arrived at the £45 million refurbishment cost and what they hope this level of investment will achieve. During the evidence session held at Pollock House, we heard that the aim was to replace the roof, increase the gallery space by 20% by creating a new picture gallery in the underused lecture theatre, and upgrade the facilities. But does this really cost £45 million? Then there's the funding. The Council has stated that they will fund 1/3, the lottery another third, with donations and sponsorship providing the other £15 million. Now, the new Riverside Museum opened in 2011. It raised less than 7% of the cost from donations and sponsorship, yet the Council expect to raise 1/3 of the cost from commercial sources in the current economic climate for the Burrell-Collection refurbishment. What happens if the funding is not found? Will they use the £15 million earmarked for the aborted George Square refurbishment to close the gap? We also have the timing of the refurbishment that's due to start in 2016. What happens between now and then? Will the gallery remain open for this 2-year period? And what steps will the Council take to protect the items on display during this time? Consideration also has to be given to the 200,000 people, many from overseas, who visit the gallery every year. During the estimated 4-year closure period, will the Council provide a temporary display area for the collection so that the city continues to benefit from it? One option may be to use the McClellan Galleries that has been closed for 10 years but brought back into temporary use recently by the Royal Glasgow Institute, who hosted their 152nd annual exhibition there in December. Presiding Officer, the Burrell-Collection was left to the people of Glasgow, and it is now time the Council informed its citizens what its detailed plans are for the refurbishment of the Burrell Gallery. Thanks.
I now call on Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this, the final debate on the Burrell-Collection Bill. I'd like to take this opportunity, as I did at the preliminary stage debate, to thank the witnesses for taking the time to submit evidence in writing and in person, to the committee clerks for pulling together lists of potential witnesses, compiling and distributing written submissions and giving legal advice on different aspects of the proposal, to the convener for our smooth running of committee meetings and the consensual approach to the proposal, and to the promoter for accommodating the guided tour of the Burrell-Collection and being flexible with some of the requests from the committee. The Burrell-Collection is a large collection of art and artefacts, although you just don't quite grasp how large it is, and you don't appreciate how large it is until you visit the art stores underneath the displays and see the sheer volume of items which aren't on display. The collection was gifted to the City of Glasgow Corporation by Sir William Burrell in 1944, and additional items were added to the collection by the Sir William Burrell Trust, which was established by Sir William's will when he died in 1958. The Burrell-Collection is housed in the custom design building in Pollock Country Park. As a result of a poorly designed roof, members of staff are constantly moving exhibitions to protect them from water damage. Large exhibition spaces are closed to the public, restricting the space available to display items, and the tarpaulins, which have been arranged into giant green funnels to direct water into wheelie bins, don't quite add to the atmosphere of a gallery housing magnificent and priceless works of art. Water continues to leak through the roof, as the source of the leak, or probably multiple sources of leaks, can't be identified. After the water has penetrated the roof, it's then absorbed by that layer of insulation which sits underneath until it's saturated, and then water leaks out at random points throughout the building, threatening items in the collection, which then means that staff are always on the lookout for new sources of water running along ceiling beams or down walls, rather than actually speaking to members of the public to offer advice about interpretation about the pieces of art that are being displayed there. Many experts have stated that water damage to some of those fragile artworks could be disastrous. But similarly, the repeated moving of exhibitions and pieces of art because of the water in itself also causes increased risk of wear and tear. There's also the issue of controlling the humidity, the air pressure, air temperature in the collection, which is of critical importance to preserving works of art. That's made much more difficult by a layer of wet insulation sitting on a roof, and that's something that I can understand clearly from an engineering perspective. But the key issue in all this is that if we, as a Parliament, feel that it was appropriate for us to approve of altering the will of someone who is no longer here, now, that isn't about borrowing or lending, though. Sir William was already clear that he approved of borrowing and lending within the UK. This is about the power to borrow and lend overseas. Although there is a precedent, and we heard evidence from other trusts who disregarded some benefactors' wishes for what they put as practical reasons. And I think the reason for refurbishment of the collection building falls firmly into that category of practical reasons. It's been speculated that because of Sir William's considerable shipping expertise, that he was uncomfortable with his treasured items travelling by boat and the potential for a sea disaster, meaning that any number of items could be lost. Now, while it would be impossible to know why Sir William did stipulate that in his will, insurers and transporters have stated that art transport has understandably changed dramatically since Sir William's time. Today, the biggest risks are when transporting pieces of art are when they're packed and unpacked, and that's a point that's been touched on before, meaning that lending and borrowing within the UK has a similar risk to lending overseas, and also that risk of taking pieces of art down from wall displays and moving them to different locations because of that water ingress, again presents that risk associated with transport too, so that there is a balance as to whether items are possibly safer in foreign museums, which would allow for the refurbishment to bring items back. Presiding Officer, as I've said, it would be impossible to second-guess the motives for the stipulation in the will, But given the requirement to carry out works in the collection building, I would ask Parliament to support the bill at decision time. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Jackson Carlow to wind up the debate. Mr Carlow, up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I too start by congratulating Joan McAlpine on the way she moved the motion and convened the committee, to the clerks and to all those who gave evidence to it. To note that there were no objections to the bill received, that we passed the stage 1 without any disagreement, that there were no amendments at stage 2, and that therefore, with a great deal of consensus, we move forward now to the third stage, the final stage of the bill today. I can well remember in 1983 the Burrell-Collection opening in Glasgow's Pollock Park. This wonderful lung in the centre of the city, donated to it in perpetuity by the Stirling Maxwell family. It also plays hosts to the activities of the young ladies of Craigholme School for Girls, who I think whack hockey sticks around at one end of it, to the police and dog-mounted divisions of Police Scotland, and to various sports clubs. But there in the heart of the park, in 1983, Her Majesty opened the Burrell-Collection building. A citadel, if you like, of aluminium, glass, concrete and red sandstone. Oh, I'm building up here, Mr Finlay. Don't spoil the illusion. It was like the city of Oz on a gleaming hill when it opened, and of course attracted all manner of people to it who had never, in many cases, visited an art collection before. Mr Finlay.
Neil Finlay.
I'm glad the member can remember it. Given that Mr Griffin wasn't born at that time, maybe you could tell him about it.
Jackson Carlow.
An invitation I was planning to undertake in any event, Mr Finlay, but yes. And so the building opened in 1983. I have to say it stimulated in me personally, as someone who lived near to it, a tremendous interest, along with many other people, in the arts, because what Sir William had donated to the city and now was contained within the Burrell-Collection building in Pollock Park is probably one of the finest individual collections ever assembled anywhere in the world. It is hugely eclectic in its nature, whether it be Egyptian, whether it be the very, very fine Chinese collection, whether it be the medieval suits of armour, whether it even be, as I found on my tour of the basement of the items rarely displayed, one of the world's largest collection of Tudor bed frames, perhaps in itself not the most exciting draw one could imagine. Whether it be in its pastels, the fantastic collection of Degas. I very much remember as a young man being struck by Boudin's Jetty at Trouville with the Empress Eugénie promenading at Trouville. I remember buying a print of it and it then stimulating in me a desire to visit the Jeu de Paume in Paris, where at that time all the Impressionist paintings were gathered before they were then moved to the Musée d'Orsay. And I think in other people too, it stimulated an interest in arts in the widest possible sense. In addition to the things I've mentioned, it has the Warwick vase, it has a fine collection of bronzes, including busts by Rodin. It has a tremendous collection of Turkish carpets, which I have to say, as a young man of 24, all of which looked a bit gloomy to me. A terrific collection of tapestries, of wonderful stained glass. And from Sir William's own home, 4 rooms that were actually imported in their entirety into the fabric of the building. It was one of the most exciting new museums of its time. But sadly, tastes and times change. And for all that we would have wished that the building had proved to be more robust, as other members have said, the committee were persuaded that a phased renovation of the Burrell-Collection was simply not going to be possible because of the membrane nature of the roof, which has absorbed so much water and moisture and is therefore leaking at points not related to the actual originating point of any leak. And so the building now must undergo a major renovation. I think it's also fair to say that what was new and exciting in terms of display and presentation in 1983 is far less so today, and that the museum's attendances have fallen sharply over the years since. So I think the committee were persuaded that the building does need to be renovated. The question then was whether or not to accede to the Council's wish to vary the terms of Sir William's will in order that the collection could travel internationally. He'd never had any objection to the collection being lent elsewhere within the United Kingdom, but at the time of making his bequest, he had specifically stated he did not wish to see it travel internationally, and we were in no position other than to try and give consideration as to what was underpinning Sir William's terms of his bequest at that point. And I think we were reasonably satisfied, given that he had no objection to the collection being lent, that his principal concern was that international travel of the collection was such that there was a very real risk of the collection or parts of it being lost were it to be toured internationally. That was then, this is now, and we heard from many witnesses, some themselves involved in the transportation of arts and antiquities, who were satisfied that we could now allow that variation to take place without there being any undue risk to the collection. And people who have made representations, and it's interesting, they still come in from those who are concerned about these issues, have objected in essence to one of two things. Either they can point to an example somewhere of an artefact being damaged in transit, without, I think, appreciating that 9 times out of 10 that damage has been by porters within the museum that the exhibit currently rests in, being moved from one part of the museum to the other, not really relating to any international travel. Or secondly, a slightly academic argument which began about whether or not we were setting some precedent about bequests in general and the terms associated with them by agreeing to a variation of Sir William Burrell's. And we took evidence from Professor George Gretton on this issue. And I think he made an interesting point, which was beyond the brief of the committee. But he did make an interesting point as to for how long after a bequest is made the terms of that can reasonably be expected to be maintained. And he thought that a period of some 50 years was a reasonable period of time, if that were to be the debate that one was having. But in fact, our concern was, what would the benefit be of the collection being toured? And the benefit, quite simply, is this. Attendances have fallen from 1 million to barely 200,000. The Burrell-Collection is still in a wonderful location and refurbished, with other parts of it that I didn't know exist, a theatre, an artist's rooms, various conservation rooms, being adapted to display more of the collection, with the publicity that will be attendant of taking this wonderful collection that belongs to Glasgow and to Scotland around the world. We will, in effect, be a magnificent shop window for tourism, not just to the city, but to the country, and also, I think, be able to then borrow other items which Sir William himself had bid for but didn't get, which would form a complete set of some of the artefacts on display. So, I say, Presiding Officer, this is an opportunity, I think, for Parliament to give the Burrell-Collection, to give Glasgow and to give Scotland an opportunity to boost its cultural representation abroad and to recreate that fabulous collection in a refurbished facility in Glasgow in Pollok Park.
Many thanks. Well done. And that concludes the debate on the Burrell-Collection, Lending and Borrowing Scotland Bill. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 8800 in the name of Michael Matheson on suicide prevention. I'll invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now. We have an ample sufficiency of time this afternoon, and I'm able, therefore, to give the Minister a generous 13 minutes, and others similarly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I say that I'm pleased to be able to open this debate today on behalf of the Scottish Government. As the motion says, significant progress has been made in recent years in prevention of suicide. In 2012, there were 762 deaths by suicide in Scotland. We all wish to see this number being lower, but the 2012 figure nevertheless represents a welcome decrease on the number of suicides in 2011. The 2012, as with each of the previous 2 years, saw one of the lowest levels of suicide in Scotland since 1991. The 3-year rolling average rate shows that between 2000 and 2002 and 2010-2012, there has been an overall downward trend in suicide rates, with an overall decrease in Scotland of some 18%. That progress reflects what I believe is the priority that both the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament have given to suicide prevention and to mental health in its work since devolution began. Attention has been given by this Parliament to suicide prevention and to the wider mental health policy agenda over a significant number of years now, and that's widely recognised by many out with Scotland. But as the motion also says, there is still work to be done to reduce suicide further. In December 2013, we published our new suicide prevention strategy for 2013-14. This is intended to build on the previous work, whilst setting out commitments and actions for the next 3 years. Presiding Officer, I'm going to say something about what has been achieved already, the firm basis on which we have built our new commitments. And I'll also say something about how we developed our new suicide strategy. And I want to also talk about the importance of basing practical actions on established and emerging evidence in order to benefit people who are at risk of suicide and also those who care for them. As members are aware, the Choose Life Suicide Prevention Strategy and Action Plan was published in 2002 as a 10-year strategy. At the end of 2012, we formed a working group in order to consider the future strategy and action on prevention of suicide and self-harm. With this group and a reference group, we developed an engagement paper to support a progress for development, developing a new strategy on prevention of suicide and self-harm. From February to May last year, several engagement events took place across the country, at which stakeholders, including interested members of the public, had the opportunity to feed in their aspirations for a new phase of suicide prevention action in Scotland. The engagement paper prompted discussion on a range of key issues, both at the engagement events and in the many written responses that were received. These responses helped to inform the preparation of our new strategy on prevention of suicide, and I'll say a little more about that later. It is worth reflecting, though, firstly on some of the progress which we have seen in suicide prevention over recent years by people working in a range of sectors across Scotland. I mentioned that in 2012, as with each of the previous 2 years, saw one of the lowest levels of suicide in Scotland since 1991, and that since the period of 2000 to 2002, there has been an overall downward trend in suicides with an overall decrease of 18%. This means that we have achieved most of the planned reductions in suicide rates as set out in the Choose Life strategy. Looking to the future, as I mentioned, our engagement paper prompted discussion on a range of key issues, both at the engagement events and in the many written responses we received. The comments it received were considered by my officials, by the working group and also by the reference group. Through these deliberations, we have developed a robust new suicide prevention strategy for Scotland. I had the pleasure of launching the strategy last month when I addressed the annual stakeholders forum organised by NHS Health Scotland's Choose Life programme team. The strategy contains 11 commitments across 5 themed areas. The 5 themed areas are responding to people in distress, talking about suicide, improving the NHS response to suicide, developing the evidence base, and supporting change and improvement. Our purpose in this strategy is to focus direction on a number of key areas for future work that are we believe will continue the downward trend in suicide in Scotland that we've seen over the last 10 years. We want this strategy to deliver better outcomes to people who are suicidal and who come to services, to their families and carers, and to those not in contact with services, but also to make sure that we see improvements in our knowledge of what works in this complex field. We acknowledge that there is a broader focus of activities not directly related to suicide prevention, but which, if taken forward effectively, contribute to reducing the overall rate of suicide. Such activities include building resilience and mental health and emotional well-being in schools and in the general population, work to reduce inequality, discrimination and stigma, and the promotion of good early years services. All of this work is undertaken in a context of being vigilant about improving mental health, about supporting people who experience mental illness, and about preventing suicide. The strategy continues the trend in previous strategies to focus on where the evidence leads us. It echoes key messages learned from practice and research that suicide is preventable, that it's everyone's business, and that collaborative working is key to successful suicide prevention. Now, members may recall that the engagement paper covered prevention of both suicide and self-harm. However, taking into account the views received in the engagement process and the deliberations of the working and reference group, we have taken an approach that suicide prevention strategy should focus on suicide prevention. Whilst it covers self-harm as a risk factor for suicide, it does not specifically deal with support to people who self-harm as a coping mechanism. However, we will undertake separate work this year on supporting people at risk of self-harm, including those in distress. This will link with the commitment in the mental health strategy to develop an approach which focuses on improving the response to distress. As many members will know, we are working with NHS Tayside and other partners to develop a shared understanding of the challenge and the appropriate local responses that can engage and support people experiencing distress, as well as support for practitioners. I mentioned the importance of following the evidence. A growing evidence base has emerged in recent years, suggesting that there are practical actions which we can take to reduce suicide. For example, one of our 5 themes is improving the NHS response to suicide. This is based on evidence from a range of sources, such as the Scottish Suicide Information Database, ScotSID, which point to the actions which can be taken in the NHS setting to support people who may be at risk of suicide, and also the National Confidential Inquiry into Suicide and Homicide by people with mental illness. ScotSID has thrown up challenges which we need to look at further. For example, those who die by suicide tend to have had quite extensive contact across a range of healthcare services, including our GPs, accident emergency departments and acute hospitals. And ScotSID also throws up that at the time of death, many people are receiving some form of medication used in the treatment of mental illness. So we have set out commitments on ways in which the NHS can focus on effectiveness of treatment that brings benefits to patients. Analysis from the confidential inquiry has already informed safety improvements for patients, prioritised attention to follow-up and follow-up for patients after discharge from hospital, and supported to focus on actions to tackle problems around drinking and drug use. We also have a strong research community in Scotland which is internationally recognised. This stands us in good stead as we move forward and continually improve evidence base around suicide and how we can support people who are at risk. Whilst the strategy has a strong focus on services that was set out in the previous Choose Life strategy, it's not intended to replace the existing population health work which many people and agencies have been doing to help prevent suicide in Scotland. We expect much of the elements of the suicide prevention action set out in this strategy to continue along the work which has already taken place as part of the Choose Life legacy. Indeed, one of the commitments within the new strategy is that NHS Health Scotland will continue to host the Choose Life programme. This national programme will, among other responsibilities, continue to provide leadership and direction to local Choose Life coordinators. We are also committed to working closely with NHS Health Scotland, CME and other agencies to develop an engagement strategy to influence public perception about suicide and the stigma surrounding it. Presiding Officer, how we talk about suicide is important. We know that talking openly about suicide in a responsible manner saves lives. We have adopted that approach through the Choose Life campaigns. Suicide, don't hide it, talk about it, and read between the lines. And we will continue to campaign in this way during the period of this new strategy. It is also important to continue to challenge media misconceptions which sometimes still arise about suicide and about suicide numbers and rates in Scotland. Presiding Officer, suicide prevention remains a significant challenge, but progress over the last several years has been very encouraging. We are proud of what we have achieved collectively so far in Scotland in improving population mental health, in improving services for people who experience mental illness, and in significantly reducing the rate of suicide. Our new suicide prevention strategy reflects the high priority which we attach to this agenda. The strategy reflects a changing landscape, but we still need to make sure we have the right commitment and energy to implement it and continue to make progress. The strategy builds on existing successful suicide prevention work and also sets out new commitments based on emerging evidence about risk factors associated with suicide. Presiding Officer, I look forward to seeing further progress being made over the coming years. I know that practitioners and others across numerous services and agencies will continue to approach this work with the dedication and commitment which they have shown over recent years. Presiding Officer, I am confident that we have a shared objective in this Parliament of the continued improvement in suicide prevention in Scotland, and I have no doubt that all members today will want to support our aims in achieving that.
Many thanks. I now call on Neil Findlay, a generous 9 minutes.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Suicide is an issue that affects far too many families and communities across the world. It's reported that an astonishing 1 million people commit suicide every year. That's 1 every 40 seconds, more than in all the world's murders and wars combined. There are, of course, many reasons why people decide to take their own lives, but whatever the reasons are, the fact that we have 1 million avoidable deaths through suicide taking place every year is a truly shocking statistic. I, of course, echo the sentiments of the Minister and the Scottish Government that much work needs to be done, and as such I welcome the new suicide prevention strategy that the Government is introducing. I hope this will build on the already good work currently being carried out by the likes of the Choose Life programme and various other programmes which local authorities, health boards, communities and many other agencies are involved in. Prevention is, of course, the key to all activity and informs the new national strategy. However, in forming any prevention strategy, we have to be fully aware of the facts and figures so we can target resources effectively. We need to know why, for example, men are nearly 3 times more likely than women to take their own lives. We need to understand that the most vulnerable group is men between the age of 35 and 44. However, also men in the groups aged between 25 and 34 and 45 and 54 appear to be also very highly vulnerable. What I find stark is the socio-economics of this, the very strong correlation between suicide rates and levels of social and economic deprivation. In 2008 to 12, the age standardised rate was over 4 times higher in the most deprived tenth of the population compared to the least deprived group of population. And I have to say, Presiding Officer, with income levels falling, welfare changes and the general thrust of austerity, desperation can and does creep into people's lives when they're on the breadline. If you look at the report by the Samaritans, report entitled Men and Suicide, Why It's a Social Issue, they point to increased risk as income goes down, increased risk in groups with poorer education and amongst unskilled manual workers and social housing tenants. One other point on the statistics. I note the figures in the motion and within the Government's new document state there has been an 18% reduction in the past 10 years. However, in looking at local authority figures prior to this debate, it appears that there is a difference in the headline figure and the strategy and the figures for the local authorities. And maybe after the debate, the Minister can maybe, or maybe at the end, the Minister can clarify the difference between what's in the document and the figures being produced by the local authorities. And I don't make that as a political point, just as a point of clarification. Beyond the statistics, we need to focus and refocus on prevention, targeting people and groups in the communities where they live. There are, as you would expect, many sources of information and analysis on this subject. And the report that I referred to, Men and Suicide, Why It's a Social Issue, highlights a number of things, but one that jumps out is this socio-economic dimension. The fact that we have these much more significantly higher figures in these communities is something that we need to address. And as a general rule, the poorer you are, the most likely you are to self-harm. And if you consider it just on a very basic level, if you live in poor housing, have a very low income, if you're under financial pressure, if you don't have support systems around you, and if your life seems devoid of hope, then it's maybe unsurprising, but nevertheless upsetting that some people take this appalling option. For other people, it's major events or changes in their lives that are the trigger. It could be job loss, relationship breakdown, the death of a friend or a loved one, or a change in physical health or mental well-being. And the Samaritans report points to a number of factors that contribute to these high figures. A person's background, personality traits, masculinity, relationship breakdown, the challenges of midlife and emotional literacy as being the main factors. And these are issues that I think we have to recognise and address in any strategy going forward. And of course, it's the case that we need to draw people out to share their feelings and concerns. I'm sure we would all recognise that we as Scots are maybe not the best in talking about our personal difficulties. We may be very free with our moans about the weather, the national football team, physical ailments, or the after effects of a good night out. But when it comes to our inner feelings, our emotions and what's going on inside our heads, we are much more reticent. We don't tend to share those feelings. And very often the last people we're willing to share our troubles with are the very people who can help us the most, and that's the people we live and work with, the people we love and care about. There are many attractive things about our national character, but this is a part of it that we really have to try and change very quickly, because far too many of our fellow Scots who have troubles and troubled feelings, often caused by major events and experiences in their lives, resort to self-harm or suicide. Of course, then, we need to develop platforms to allow and to help people to open up, and I hope the government strategy helps ensure that that will happen. I want to finish by giving voice to someone affected by suicide, who is a relative of one of the 3,904 suicides there has been in Scotland over the past 5 years. This friend of mine told me this week about his family's experience, and I said I would relay it to Parliament. He said the issue of mental health problems and raising awareness of it needs publicised more on television, newspapers, magazine, online and in the general media. Brief, infrequent, short adverts are never going to be enough, he said. The first port of call must be for ordinary people, family and friends, to be able to spot the signs that there are problems and know what they are. More awareness through the media would certainly help, and I'm grateful that the strategy points to more use of social media. He also said the health service must get away from attempting a quick fix by readily prescribing pills for mental health conditions such as depression rather than taking a longer-term approach. He said mental health services have to be more effective and accessible. This is still not happening. It takes months to see someone, and then when the client manages to see someone, the number of sessions they are allowed is restricted. He also said his family had great support from the charity Touched by Suicide, who run 8 self-help groups and work within 5 different council areas. But they expressed their frustration at the different ways that they are treated by local authorities, some of whom are very supportive and others who appear to completely fail to recognise the support individuals bereaved by suicide need. On awareness training, they urge us to go much further and make the focus of training much wider than it has been, which appears to be, in their eyes, mainly on health service staff. And of course, GPs, nurses, health visitors, etc. need training. But I also think we need to train housing officers, benefits staff, advice workers, shop stewards, bar staff, people who work in bookmakers and bingo halls and the like, because these people will be coming into contact with people who may be at risk of self-harm. So I hope that under commitment 2 of the strategy, that training for these groups of workers will be considered. Touched by Suicide also expressed concern about support for children and young people at risk of suicide, and say not enough has been done in schools and colleges. And if a child is at risk of suicide and classed as a priority, they say the quickest they are seen is within 5 working days. That can often be too long. And there is concern about funding being a problem for small organisations when working in different areas, supporting people bereaved by suicide. Groups often have to submit multiple applications for funding for all the different geographical areas they work in. Presiding Officer, 5 years ago as a local councillor, I went through a period where 6 constituents took their own lives in my ward within an 18-month to 2-year period. 6 lives wasted, 6 families shattered and communities devastated. I hope this strategy has the impact it is designed to have. And I speak regularly to the friends and family of those people. They never forget and they never stop saying one word, and that is why.
Many thanks. Now call on Annette Milne, the generous 6 minutes, Ms Milne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's customary at the start of most debates to begin by welcoming an issue brought before this chamber for discussion. However, discussing suicide has for far too long been something which people have shied away from, something not to be talked about because of a sense of awkwardness or a difficulty in accepting how an individual's life has ended. It's also probably right to say that such a situation was even starker in previous years, where families in particular felt acute embarrassment and indeed shame if a family member took their own life. There were no support networks such as the excellent Cruise Bereavement Care Scotland in place for families to cope with their loss, and the stigma of suicide was prevalent in society. Even a survivor of suicide, someone whose attempt had failed, wasn't given the necessary help which is available today. In July 1958, Lionel Henry Churchill from Cheltenham was found in bed with a bullet wound in his forehead, having tried to take his life following the death from natural causes of his beloved wife. He lived, but instead of the medical treatment and care that he needed, he was actually sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. It's remarkable to consider that until just over 50 years ago, suicide, or self-murder as it was called, was a criminal act in Britain. Thankfully, we have moved on from those times, but we do still have a long way to go. That's why I very much welcome the Scottish Government's suicide prevention strategy, developed, as we've heard, after many discussions with a large number of stakeholders and launched last month, which puts in place measures for the next 3 years. The document focuses on 5 areas of importance, but I return to my opening remarks and to stress the value of talking about suicide, not only in terms of dealing with the after-effects of the death of a loved one, but also as a first step to stop someone from being in the position where the individual sees suicide as the only option, And I'm really quite encouraged to see in my own city, in Aberdeen, there's a prominent suicide spot in the centre of the city where there is an available phone number from Samaritans for anyone contemplating the act to go and speak to someone about what the intention is before it's too late. This theme is at the core of the strategy, and I believe it is central to breaking the taboo of suicide. By discussing suicide in a responsible manner, we can save lives. And I pay tribute to NHS Scotland's Choose Life Action Plan for developing the Suicide Don't Hide It, Talk About It campaign some years ago. This directed people to listening charities such as Samaritans and Breathing Space now being in its 10th year as a national phone line service. Next week marks Breathing Space 2014, where the message is stay connected. And I was interested to learn that this campaign is not only aimed at those who are vulnerable or at risk of suicide, but to ask all of us to keep in touch by picking up the phone, or for those more adept at it, by sending a text message to friends or family. And I'd encourage all of us to take this advice by taking time out on the 1st of February to talk to a loved one. The strategy highlights the benefit of communication through social media and the wider internet at promoting the key message of suicide prevention. However, the strategy also makes reference to the possible negative impact of such mediums, especially to those who are most susceptible to and likely to have suicidal tendencies. In this respect, I'm sure that I speak for many who have concerns about web-based chat rooms and webcams, Facebook, Twitter, and all the other online outlets currently available to people, in particular the teenagers and young adults who use them the most. The relatively new problem of cyberbullying can have tragic and devastating consequences. Figures released under FOI by my colleague Ruth Davidson just before Christmas showed that over 500 pupils across Scotland in the last 3 years have been victims of cyberbullying, and the actual figure may be higher. Anonymous comments, threats, lies, and hurtful insults online can lead to low self-esteem and, very sadly, to suicide in extreme cases. We'll all be aware of the tragic case last summer of the Fife teenager who took his own life after internet bullying and blackmail. And I wonder what measures could be put in place to ensure that a terrible event like this doesn't ever happen again. Whilst I accept the strategy can't cover all areas, I would ask the Minister if he could provide some more detail as to how he thinks the strategy's preventative approach to suicide can fit in with tackling the specific problem of cyberbullying. Presiding Officer, elsewhere in the strategy document, Theme D looks at how we can develop an evidence base to give the NHS and all other agencies a better understanding of why certain people are inclined towards suicide. I very much welcome this, as to prevent suicide and thereby reduce incidents, it requires ongoing analysis and research and evaluating information available from ScotSID and the National Confidential Inquiry into Suicide and Homicide. I particularly welcome the Government's decision to examine the effectiveness of treatment for patients experiencing mental distress and to investigate further the effects of drug and alcohol abuse as potential precursors of susceptibility to suicide. The document also draws attention to the fact that in Scotland almost 3/4 of suicides were men, and of those, 48% were in the age range 35 to 54. For Theme D to succeed further, analysis needs to be undertaken, not only identifying depression and mental health issues as factors, but also other areas which have a causal link to suicide. Financial or job worries, relationship breakdowns, stress, bereavement and so on can all contribute to suicidal feelings in men within this age range. I'd also like to see more focused scrutiny in specific groups where there's a preponderance of suicide. To give just one example, the Minister will be aware that in the last 30 years there's been a higher than average rate of suicide in male farmers and farm workers in Scotland, with 86 deaths between 1981 and 1999, as compared to 60 in fishing and its associated industries within the same period. Various factors can be cited for these statistics, such as changing farming practices, economic difficulties and geographical isolation. In this one area, the specific needs, since preventative measures to suicide need to be examined, and often the remoteness of farmers to support networks and medical treatment, hinder early diagnosis of depression and mental illness. In his introduction to the strategy document, the Minister rightly pays tribute to all of those who have worked in suicide prevention, which has resulted in a downward trend in suicides over the past 10 years in Scotland. But he also ends on a note of caution that we cannot be complacent and that commitment and energy are still required if we are to continue to make progress. I would most definitely agree with that, and I commend the Minister and his team for their work so far. Thank you.
Many thanks. We now move to the open debate, and I call on Willie Coffey to be followed by Graham Pearson. We have ample time for interventions, and I look forward to these things happening. Thank you. Mr Coffey.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Most of us speaking today will probably know of someone in their community, perhaps even their family, who's committed suicide. The loss of a loved one is devastating enough for any family to cope with, but to then discover that it came about as a result of suicide must surely pile on more anguish to those who remain. Families who have suffered this can sometimes blame themselves and wonder whether they could have been more vigilant. Could they have spotted any warning signs, and could they have done anything to prevent it? So, with the natural grief for a family member lost, comes the additional stress of whether their loved one's suicide was preventable. Cases I am aware of over the years often had something in common, and that was the total surprise from the family that there seemed to be no indication or any warning signs of what was to happen. And so any strategy to help reduce the numbers of people dying from suicide in Scotland must offer some guidance for families to help them spot these potential dangers. And I recognise that it does that in several ways. Whilst we often rely on our dedicated professionals within the health and mental health services to assist us with this, family members can play a vital role too in noticing changing patterns of behaviour with a family member. And I'll talk about that in more detail later. Presiding Officer, if we look at some of the statistics, as the Minister said in his opening speech, there were 762 probable suicides in Scotland in 2012. That's about 2 every day. It's quite a sobering thought. In the 2012 statistical report covering suicide information, 3/4 of them were males, about half were aged between 25 and 54, and those people living in the most deprived communities in Scotland were 3 times as likely to commit suicide than those in the most affluent parts of our country. But interestingly also, 2/3 of those who committed suicide were actually in employment, and over half had mental health prescriptions dispensed within 12 months prior to their death. Now, in comparison with other UK countries, Scotland's male suicide rates are significantly higher, 73% higher, and female rates were almost double, and both have remained above the Western European mean since the early 1990s. But despite these gloomy figures, there is some real encouragement in that the trends are markedly downwards, falling, as the Minister said, also about 18% in the last 10 years, and they are at the lowest levels since those days in the early 1990s. Now, much of this good work started in 2002 with the Choose Life programme, recognised as a leader in the field, and the steady decline in suicide numbers from then is a testament to the success of the population mental health and public awareness approach that was adopted. The introduction in 2008 of suicide prevention awareness training within our NHS frontline staff has built on that success, and the strategy we're talking about today is a natural progression of the approaches that have been working over a period of time. We don't need to look too far, I think, to identify some of the probable causes of suicides in Scotland, with mental illness, alcohol and drug abuse, poverty, family breakups, financial problems, all playing some part in this. However, as the Minister commented in December, we have made real progress, but we need to keep reaching out to those at risk and focus our attention on where the evidence takes us. Suicide is preventable, and we can reduce the numbers of these tragedies that families face each year. I was interested to listen in this morning to Radio Scotland's programme on depression as part of their mental health season, and the expressed need from several callers for people to be able to talk to someone at any point in a day when depression might strike them. So what are the possible warning signs? I spoke earlier about families who said they didn't notice any changing patterns of behaviour with their loved ones. I know of a case locally where a person simply left home one day with no apparent signs of what was to come and didn't come back. Neil Findlay, in his opening address, mentioned some of the causes, and perhaps these are some of the symptoms that were kindly posted on one of the NHS Choices websites I think are very useful to help families. For example, complaints of feelings of hopelessness, episodes of sudden rage and anger, reckless acts with no apparent concerns about the consequences, talking about feeling trapped, starting to abuse drugs or alcohol or more frequent use of those, noticeable weight changes due to changes in appetite, becoming increasingly withdrawn from friends, family and society, an inability to sleep, and also sleeping all the time. And of course, one that might occur to families when people begin to suddenly put their affairs in order, such as sorting out possessions or making a will. Now, Presiding Officer, families might recognise these symptoms, sadly, only after an event. But in our busy day-to-day lives, we might think nothing of some of these potential warnings. It's not to say that these are all causes to set the alarm bells ringing, but the advice from the NHS is to talk to and engage with a person and encourage them to talk about how they're feeling. Sharing any concerns with a GP or a person's care team, particularly if they are being treated for a mental health condition. Now, I expect other members will no doubt develop the key elements within the strategy, but the particular emphasis that I saw on more engagement directly with families and carers, more work to tackle stigma and discrimination, and deploying new technology to provide more helpful information for people will hopefully improve matters even further in the coming years. In conclusion, the Scottish Government's strategy for preventing suicide takes forward and builds on the very successful Choose Life programme that has seen a significant drop in these awful statistics. The public has been closely involved in developing the strategy further, and I'm sure that more gains will be made. Helping families and health workers to spot potential warning signs and providing the support mechanisms for those at risk will go some way towards reducing further the numbers of suicides in Scotland, which, as the Minister also said in his opening remarks, are entirely preventable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Graham Pearson to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to members who have contributed earlier in sharing their knowledge on this subject. But like Nanette Milne, I too am not content that we need to discuss this issue today, and it's with great sadness that we do. Far better that we as a nation did not have to face the ongoing experience of suicide in the way that's been described earlier. And in that sense, it is a tremendous battle that we face ahead of us. It's been alluded to that we face nearly 4,000 deaths in Scotland over the last 5 years. And each of these deaths, I'm sure, has left behind a legacy, a heartbreak for those who have been involved. And in that context, I welcome what the Minister has said this afternoon, and I welcome the strategy as outlined today in the document. In the introduction of the document, it lays out 3 definitions: self-harm, suicidal behaviour and suicide. And I think the experience of members this afternoon and their observations would identify that amongst the priorities we face in this regard is to focus on those early signs of behaviours that could eventually lead to either suicide or an attempt at suicide. So those who have engaged in self-harm and suicidal behaviour deserve our support at an early stage and an early intervention of some value, if we are in some way to go further in reducing the experience of suicide as we know it presently. I think we all accept that not only is the subject of the suicide itself the focus of our concerns. Around every such event, families and friends are left to question how this has occurred. Our society is left bereft in terms of the contribution that could otherwise have been made. And indeed, in many circumstances, witnesses are left behind devastated by that experience. And many statistics have been mentioned this afternoon, and rightly so. But equally, almost every day somewhere in the United Kingdom, someone steps onto a railway line and commits suicide, with the obvious impact that has not only on family and friends, but also the poor railway driver who is in the train on that date. So the ramifications from each of these circumstances are indeed severe for us all to consider. For some of us who had no knowledge of these circumstances earlier in life, we've often heard that it's been a selfish act. It's something that required more consideration. It leaves behind chaos, guilt we've heard of earlier amongst families who feel that they in some way have some responsibility, a notion of blame needing to be asserted. But thankfully, I think we've come to understand that this whole event, this circumstance, is based essentially on illness, a pressure, an inability to see a way forward, which in some way, and for many in a way that's not understandable, but nevertheless is so prevalent, we can come to know that human beings feel the only way forward is unfortunately to take their own life. The sadness and the impact of that, I don't think we can consider too often and try to respond. The circumstances that lie behind it, there is no doubt, as Willie Coffey mentioned earlier, a propensity in Scotland which isn't seen elsewhere in Western Europe, particularly amongst male members, in engaging in suicide. Alcohol and substance abuse obviously has some impact, and we're all aware of the levels of alcohol and substance abuse that are present here. Joblessness has been mentioned, poverty also, and bad debt. Hopelessness lies behind it, and sometimes homelessness. And no doubt our thanks are due to NHS Scotland, to the Samaritans, to Breathing Space, to Salvation Army and many of the third sector groups who work tirelessly in this regard. For the future, within the strategy as outlined, education is obviously of very great significance in understanding some of the early signs and recognising the pressures that individuals face. I think increasingly a knowledge of talking about these issues and getting it out there into the domain, the publicity that attaches to it, the knowledge within the workplace, an area where signs can be seen, an education of workers knowing that colleagues are under pressure and some steps can be taken. It's a very sensitive issue. Signs can be misread, but far better that we take steps to help each other than step aside and not want to be in the Scottish way. Let's not be nosy about our pals' interests or our neighbours' futures. We should step in and at least show kindness and an interest. And also those social events that are predominant in Scotland, the football matches where the male sensitivities are put aside, there's a place to be advertising amongst that kind of groupings and pop concerts and the likes, that there is a problem, almost unspoken of until one experiences it firsthand. So the identifications are the important issue. But equally, as has been alluded to, the real-time responses. I too listened to the radio this morning, and it became self-evident that when people need help, they need it immediately and they need someone to speak to. And although the Samaritans are there and a great support, more needs to be done in that regard, and I'm sure the Minister will give thought to that. Equally mentioned was the use of sport and recreation to get people out into the open air and get people involved in groups. And although this is not part of an NHS strategy, one would hope the Minister could give us some insight into that cooperative work, those partnerships that we always talk about in delivering alternative solutions to our problems. The monitoring and reassessing and constant reassessing of the strategy will be very significant in the years ahead as we go forward. And I'm pleased to hear that there is no complacency in regarding these falls as in themselves a success. One life saved is something that we should laud and be pleased about. We would want to try and save all these lives for the future. And in that context, I welcome the 11 commitments that are outlined in the document and would encourage the Minister to do more as the evidence presents itself. Thanks very much, Presiding Officer.
And thank you. Now calling Kevin Stewart to be followed by Kenny Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And first of all, I'd like to pay tribute to the organisations out there who are doing a huge amount of work in tackling mental health stigma and trying to prevent suicide. Organisations such as SAMH, Choose Life coordinators and volunteers across the country, and the Samaritans, who have been mentioned quite a lot during the course of this debate thus far. And many of us will have had the privilege just recently to meet Samaritans from right across Scotland who are doing immense work in my community in Aberdeen and elsewhere. SAMH, in their briefing for this debate, have a number of questions, and it's a number of questions that I've asked myself in a previous guise as a local councillor, and they ask in terms of the Scottish Government how they will ensure that local authorities and community planning partnerships are held to account for the suicide prevention work they're obliged to do under single outcome agreements, and they call for more transparency from local authorities and others in pointing out what they're doing. And I think that that's required, and I'm convinced that a lot of good work is going on, but this is often a subject that we don't talk enough about. And it comes to one of the main points that I have, because we talk about relatives and friends who die of natural causes, but it's quite often that folk will not talk about those folks that they have known who have taken their own lives. And I think, you know, we must get much better at that. We also have an obligation, in my opinion, to challenge behaviour, because far too often in society and in the media in particular, we see that stigmatisation of mental health. We have seen headlines galore over many, many years using language which should not be used, in my opinion, to describe folks with mental health problems. And I think that all of us here and beyond should be challenging those behaviours. And of course, we have the new media, the social media, as Dr. Milne talked about in her speech. And we see a huge amount of bullying and horrid language there. And before this debate, I looked at some of the cases that there have been recently, and Dr. Milne talked about the young man in Dunfermline that seen no way out but to take his own life after being blackmailed after using the internet. And there are countless stories out there. But one really struck me was a headline which was, "Ballygirl was hooked on Tumblr where users encourage her to harm herself." Now, you know, that's kind of beyond my ken. Why would anybody do this? But obviously, this is happening. That girl later took her own life. And I think that we should be looking at trying to ensure that social media use is not used to bully and to leave folk with what they see as very little option. And I think that we can do this. And looking at other aspects, a BBC Scotland report from the 22nd of June 2012 states social media could cut suicide. And it talks of a study by Stirling University in 2009, where 1 in 5 school children said the internet, including social networking sites, influenced their decisions to self-harm. And it goes on and says, now the researchers say the possible dangers posed by new media could be counteracted if the sites provided support for vulnerable young people. And there's a quote in that report from Professor Rory O'Connor, of Stirling University Suicidal Behaviour Research Laboratory. And he says the reasons for adolescent suicide and self-harm are multiple and complex. My colleagues and I see that the challenge is ensuring that new media provide support for vulnerable young people rather than helping or encouraging self-destructive behaviours. And I'm pleased to see Sam H, the Samaritans and others having a presence now on Twitter, on Facebook and other new media sites, because I think that that is immensely beneficial. And that interaction that can take place is often very helpful for people who may have some dark thoughts. It has also been highlighted in this debate the difference in suicide rates amongst the poor and the more affluent. And Mr Coffey, in his contribution, said that the number of probable suicides in the most deprived areas is more than 3 times higher than it is in more affluent areas. And one of my main concerns at this moment in time is welfare reform and the austerity measures that we're seeing taking place, directed by the Westminster Government. Because I, probably like many others in this chamber today, have folk come into me on a regular basis who feel despair, isolation and a lack of self-worth because of the changes that have been thrust upon them. And I think we need to take cognizance of the impact of these welfare reforms on people's mental well-being. And we must ensure that we do the right thing in this regard and make sure that we do all that we can to help folks who have been affected by this. In my opinion, the best way of dealing with that would be to halt these austerity measures and stop the worst impacts of welfare reform. And I hope that that will be possible in the very near future. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call on Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Jim Hume. A generous 6 minutes. Mr Gibson, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Dr. Sir Thomas Browne created the word suicide, meaning to kill oneself, in the 17th century. However, it has always been with us. The early Christian Church exalted self-sacrifice and martyrdom, yet by the Middle Ages, the Church would dissuade suicides by preaching damnation, and suicides were often denied a Christian burial, hung in chains, impaled on a stake, or disembowelled. The modern faith and secular worlds, thankfully, are much more enlightened in their approach to suicide. My own family has suffered from suicide. My great-grandmother drowned herself in the River Shannon, an uncle burned himself to death in his car, and a cousin who in the 60s often came home from school to find his mother attempting self-destruction by putting her head in the oven or standing on the window ledge at 10 found her strangled on the washing line. In this debate, therefore, the suicide I will focus on is not the wish to die of the terminally ill or those in permanent pain without quality of life, which I believe will be debated another day. It is a suicide of despair, people who see little hope in their own life now or ever. Suicide can destroy the future, a failed exam, broken relationship, loss of job or home that someone cannot see past, yet with the passage of time would surely resolve. Studies show that the children of suicides are more likely to kill themselves, as are members of the immediate family and close friends, inflicting, some have argued, a posthumous suicide. A posthumous homicide. In the last 45 years, there has been a 60% increase in the incidence of suicide worldwide, and as Neil Finlay pointed out, there is now between 800,000 and 1 million people who kill themselves in the world every year. And every single one of these is, of course, a tragedy. Scotland has not been immune from this global trend, as we have heard already today. The latest study from the Prince's Trust revealed that a third of young unemployed people had considered suicide, and 9% have nothing to live for. Furthermore, the rate of suicide is 3 times higher in the most deprived populations of Scotland than the general population.
The decline in living standards is therefore something that must be considered when looking at this matter and attempting to establish a strategy towards preventing suicide. Whilst we've heard today of the devastating impact of suicide upon families and communities and efforts to tackle the issue, it is important to remember there are specific groups in society more at risk of suicide, and it is wise to focus on assisting these where possible. And of course, not all groups who suffer from suicide are deprived. There are higher instances, and Nanette Milne pointed out, among farmers, but also among doctors, nurses and vets. And one may consider that access to the means of suicide is another reason for it. Veterans within the armed forces are also a group where the rate of suicide is higher than a wider population. This can be for reasons including difficulty in adapting to life outside the forces, living with the trauma of conflict, or suffering from mental and physical problems related to their time in service. I'm therefore pleased that Scotland is the first nation in the UK to appoint a Veterans Commissioner to work with charities, local authorities and health boards to identify public services that might provide greater support to veterans. This commitment will complement the £1.4 million annual funding from the Scottish Government for specialist mental health and community outreach services provided by Combat Stress to help veterans who need support. As Deputy Convener of the cross-party group on adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, I know that people with a history of childhood sexual abuse have a greater likelihood of suicide. The Beyond Trauma study by Dr Sarah Nelson of Edinburgh University focused specifically on the mental health needs of female survivors, half of whom revealed they had tried to kill themselves, making often repeated attempts. In a needs assessment of adult male survivors of childhood sexual abuse by NHS Lothian, it was found that male suicidal behaviour was even more acute than in female survivors, with most male survivors having attempted suicide, again often on several occasions. Very often, survivors of childhood sexual abuse not only have to live with their experiences, but struggle with addictions developed as a result of them. As is pointed out in the suicide prevention strategy, substance abuse often increases the likelihood of an individual attempting to take their life, making this group also particularly vulnerable. Often the best way for survivors to rebuild their lives is to discuss their experiences, understand what happened to them, know that they are not alone, and rediscover their self-esteem and trust in others. Organisations across the country support survivors of childhood sexual abuse and carry out vital work to help those most in need tackle the problems as a result of trauma. I'm pleased that Survivor Scotland was allocated £1.65 million from the Scottish Government between 2012 and 2014 to fund a variety of projects to continue this invaluable work, as individuals at risk of suicidal behaviour require continued support to ensure they do not end their own lives. Presiding Officer, a couple of years ago I chaired a Samaritans Edinburgh University seminar here in the Parliament on the immediate impact of suicide. And the National Union of Journalists who attended must be commended for their serious approach to suicide prevention, encouraging journalists to report suicide sensitively, as sensationalist coverage of reporting which appears to glorify or romanticise suicide can lead to many more copycat suicides. Whilst they thankfully remain rare, suicide clusters can have a devastating impact in a local area, and one only needs to cast their mind back a few years to the tragic events in Bridgend, South Wales, where dozens of teenagers and young adults committed suicide in the space of a few short years. At the time, many blamed sensational and excessive media coverage of these tragedies for increased suicide, and in 2010 the police asked the media to cease reporting on them in an effort to deter copycats, and eventually the trend subsided. The continued dialogue between the NUJ and the Scottish Government is welcome as our efforts to ensure sensitive reporting on mental health issues and suicide through the publication of practical guidelines and journalist training. Presiding Officer, yeah, if possible, yeah.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Mr Gibson for giving way. And I'm glad that he is talking about the inroads that have been made in terms of reporting, and there are a huge amount of responsible journalists out there. One of the things which I think is very little discussed is the way that folks with mental health difficulties are often portrayed in entertainment programmes, such as X Factor, for example. Does Mr Gibson agree with me that we should be challenging these producers of television programmes as well as the print media?
Gibson.
I have to say it's a programme I've never ever watched, actually, so I find it difficult to comment on that one in particular. But of course, I think all stereotypes involving people with mental health issues, I think, should certainly be challenged if we're to have a much healthier society going forward. Presiding Officer, having taken a great interest in this most tragic of subjects during my time in Parliament, it is encouraging to see the work being put in by each and every administration since devolution began to reduce the number of suicides in Scotland and to see such strong cross-party support for the work being done. It's clear that a comprehensive, far-reaching and national approach to suicide prevention is essential, and I'm pleased that all members are able to unite to provide the best outcomes for individuals and families most in need of our support.
Many thanks. I now call on Jim Hume to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you.
6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too welcome the publication of the Scottish Government's new suicide prevention strategy, and I do commend the Minister for providing us with this opportunity to debate its contents. Suicide is an incredibly sensitive issue and one which must be treated as such by all of us across society. Willie Coffey has already mentioned it, but I dare say that most of us in this chamber will know of someone who has either committed or attempted suicide. I know of more than one, unfortunately, and Kenny Gibson's also mentioned a few of his family members too. It's hard to articulate just how much the friends or relatives of those concerned can suffer in the aftermath. So it's important that we drive down the number of suicides in Scotland, and that any framework put in place to achieve this is, of course, fit for purpose. The latest strategy does follow on from Choose Life, published back in 2002, and it does certainly build upon some of the successes of its predecessor. An 18% reduction in suicides in Scotland. All probationary police officers and 50% of frontline NHS staff now trained in suicide prevention techniques provides a good platform from which to build upon. I've highlighted in previous debates on mental health that it was absolutely vital we ended the spectre of patients being condemned to long-term prescriptions for antidepressants without regular reviews of the response to the treatment. The strategy has highlighted how important it is we make a concerted effort to change this. Many of those at the time of their death were receiving a form of medication used in the treatment of mental illness. Perhaps something as simple as a review of the medication with a change in dosage or drug may have made a difference to their mood. I remind the Minister of the successful pilot, which you'll be very aware of, previously held in Glasgow, which saw participating practices review those on antidepressants for over 2 years, which did lead to 28% of patients having a change in their therapy and an 8% reduction in prescribing costs. So it can have a difference, but I do appreciate that the use of antidepressants are, of course, very essential in many cases. I was delighted to come upon Commitment 7 in the strategy, which reads, "We will work with the Royal College of General Practitioners and other relevant stakeholders to develop approaches to ensure more regular review of those on long-term drug treatment for mental illness, to ensure that patients receive the safest and most appropriate treatment." I also welcome this important commitment's inclusion in the strategy, and would be grateful if, when he is summing up, the Minister could provide a timeframe from when he plans to engage with the stakeholders to work towards these much-needed reviews. In 2008, the Scottish Government published Equally Well, a document with recommendations on tackling health inequalities. It stated, as one of the challenges facing the Ministerial Task Force, was that those living in most deprived 10% of areas of Scotland have a suicide risk double that of the Scottish average. And I appreciate Nanette Milne and Kenny Gibson's mentioning of farmers, of course, vets, etc. And I think there's without doubt that there's a high incidence in those particular cases because they do have access to means of committing suicide. But I was disappointed that health inequalities merited only one mention in the strategy, and a fleeting one, I think. There's a link between inequalities and greater rates of suicides. It's acknowledged in Equally Well and should surely be merited as a greater inclusion in the overall discussion of preventing suicide. Timely access to psychological therapies obviously has a role to play, I believe, as part of treating those with mental illness. more effectively and, as a knock-on effect, hopefully reducing the number of suicides even further. I therefore did welcome the inclusion of access to psychological therapies within 18 weeks of referral as a positive step. However, I would caution that 18 weeks for someone suffering from mental anguish is a long time to wait, as of course many patients will have suffered for some time before their referral. I don't think the Minister should limit the extent of his ambitions to 18 weeks, therefore. With the target due for delivery by December this year, this really isn't the time to move backwards, as there was a 3% drop in September for those being treated on time, with 1/5 of those having to wait over 18 weeks for treatment. I think the Scottish Government can't quite rest on its laurels yet. I've spoken with the head of psychological services for One Health Board, who told me that alongside their counterparts in other areas, they are constantly making the case for greater investment in mental health service. And I had a visit yesterday to Mid Park Hospital in Dumfries, which I know the Minister was there in 2012. Saw his signature, I should say, on the visitors' book. NHS boards are seeing increasing demand for the services due to the economic downturn, but perhaps more positively, because the public are becoming much more aware of the services' availability. I think and I hope that we may be beginning to see some erosion of the stigma that has plagued mental health. The Scottish Government will need to continue to address this, of course, but it will also have to address the clear disparity that exists across Scotland in accessing clinical and other applied psychologists. It can't be right that per head of population, Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Fife have twice the number of psychologists than Forth Valley. If the heat target is to be met later this year, then that must be addressed, I think, as a matter of urgency. Suicide is a difficult thing for those left to comprehend. I'm glad that we're making progress with a decrease in suicides and look forward to much more progress in the near future.
Many thanks. And I now call on Christine Graham, a very generous 6 minutes, after which I'm happy to call on James Dornan.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I start by complimenting this Parliament on discussing the issue of mental health and suicide prevention, because it has, over my long time, it seems, in this Parliament, raised this issue many times, as and gone some way to destigmatising these issues, and indeed in providing funding, particularly to the voluntary sector, which I want to come to later. And I think it's refreshing to be in a debate which, for the most part, from a wee hit or two from Jim Hume, is devoid of party politics and point scoring, which is as it should be. I welcome the Government's suicide strategy, continuing the earlier work on harm reduction and early intervention and destigmatising. And I recognise, I want to put this in a record, he was very humble in it, but the work done by my colleague Kenneth Gibson, because Kenneth Gibson raised the issue in 1999, when I had no idea it was talking about, of young men and high rates of suicide. And he's pursued this for years, and I suppose only those of us who've been in here for 14 years can recall that. But Kenny Gibson has kept to this subject, as others have done in this Parliament, for a very long time. I compliment him on it because we're catching up with him. I want to focus on the third sector, which is important, informed because of its grassroots contribution, illustrated in my own constituency, where face-to-face help is provided. And that's very important, because there can be clever websites and clever things to do, but sometimes you just need someone right in front of you to talk to you with a cup of tea and listen to you, and no website can provide that. Secondly, I want to talk about the role of education, in particular raised by many in here, but begun by Nanette Milne, for the responsible use of social media, which definitely has an increasing part to play. Now, Penumbra in my constituency promotes mental health and well-being, aiming to prevent mental ill health for people who they see at risk, and they provide support as well. And it's practical, accessible help based in the community, and it's right in the middle of Gala Shields with big offices, so that destigmatises it right away. It's cheery, it's got well-painted, fresh rooms, coffee, tea. It says something about mental health, which, if we're all honest, we know affects very many people, including many relations and friends, at some time in their life. Health in Mind provides befriending services, offering 6 monthly matches, initially operating with Midlothian and the border. So you get 6 months of a befriender that matches you to get you out and about, to get you busy, to get you out of your house, out of your cocoon, get you confident again with the outside world, building your self-confidence and self-esteem, which is so easily vanquished by anyone. Redundancy can take it at the click of her fingers. A broken relationship and all that cockiness she had and all that self-esteem goes. So it can happen to anyone. So it's rebuilding that so that people can cope with what many people cope with every day without any problem. But we could all be there. New Horizons, founded in 1993. This is an informal meeting place where it's a self-help group, promoting, helping each other get through their problems and so on. It even leads to romance. It led to a marriage, because I met the couple who'd met there and had married. But, you know, interestingly, and this is a side thing about it, the bedroom tax affects people with mental health problems, because one of the members there was telling me that she can't share because of mental health issues, and yet she was being asked to have somebody else in the spare room or be taxed on it because she had an empty room. But because of her condition, she had to live on her own. And it's just a side effect of it. Anyway, together they play a collective role, not only with each other, but they actually contribute to the planning of mental health services across the Scottish borders. In Midlothian, we have Midspace Mental Health and Wellbeing Information Service. That's online. That's for people who say, where do I go for this? And it points them in different directions about their treatment and their care. Sam H, of course, others have mentioned, which is focusing in my area on employability. Very important. And while I'm on the subject, it's very, very difficult for somebody with mental health issues to disclose these to an employer. They're not going to put it on in a form. They're not going to mention it. They can say they've had chicken pox, but they won't say they've had a breakdown at some time because they fear that that's them right off. They're not going to pursue the career anymore. So there's still issues with employers. But not all who may commit suicide are mentally in a position to access services, as I've said. Neither are they identified by the system earlier on. As I say, out of the blue, somebody can commit suicide triggered by redundancy, the end of a relationship, failing an exam, not getting the marks they thought they would get, and yet there's no warning. I'm going to move to the role of education, because we've dealt with this as well, to some extent, by the social media, with venomous bullying and distressful attacks on Facebook and blogs or in tweets. And as has been said before, there's been highly publicised examples of individuals who committed suicide substantially as a consequence of online comments. And we know it's the bad things that are said about us that we keep reading. The nasty things are the things that you can't get out your head, that come up in the middle of the dark night, and you remember a horrible comment that you read. Don't look at the mine on the internet, by the way, that are about me. But they're there. They're there about all of us. But you know these are the ones that you keep picking at and reading. So if you're vulnerable, these are the things you remember. These are the things that bite into your soul. So we see these comments. There was a lad, Lewis Thilwell, 19, at Port Talbot, bullied literally to his death because false rumours were put on the internet about him. He was vulnerable. He took the comments literally to heart, and he killed himself. In Fife, the 70-year-old Daniel Perry, involved in his innocence in a scam, then threatened with blackmail. People actually put on the internet urging him to kill himself. Anonymous users put these on the social media, ask.fm. And these had been linked to previous deaths of youngsters. Messages such as, you need to let a blade meet your throat. Who are these people that put these things online? And he was warned he would be better off dead if he didn't transfer the cash. Of course, he took these to heart and he hid it from his family. The thing is, his mother said he was not the type of person who let things get to him. And of course, these things do. I was told I had a very generous 6 minutes. Have I still got bits left? So I asked the Minister, while indeed he indicates the issues that he's dealing with, why the Ministers for Education and Children are not also involved in the mental health strategy. I want that included in the prevention strategy, because I know some schools deal with Facebook and sexting and twittering and tweeting and all that, but others don't. So isn't it time, because we're all falling behind, I know you all think we're clever clogs at technology, but we're way behind youngsters. Why are we not in schools looking at the issues of responsible use of the internet, which has implications not just for the person who puts things on the internet, which will live forever when they go out to look for a job, things they've said and done, but will have consequences for other people, which they may live to regret for the rest of their lives if they are party to leading to someone else taking their life. So I'd ask the Minister for Health to advise in his summing up whether he is communicating and discussing the Minister for Education and Children on these particular issues of the use of social media. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wasn't going to take part in this debate, but with your indulgence, I'll just make a short contribution. Some of the points that have been raised already about males between 35 and 54 being a greater preponderance of them committing suicide, I think are not understandable, but you can see why that is the group that has the most pressure. You get to an age where you feel you should have achieved something, and you may well have, but in your own head you haven't. You have that disappointment, you have the pressure, which again may not come from out with you, but internally you feel that you should have done something that you haven't managed to do, despite the fact you may well be a very successful businessman or whatever else, because that pressure that you're feeling, others don't see. I mean, Christine Graham just talked there about the mother saying he wasn't a guy that let things get to him. Very often people don't know who you are. So it may well look as if you're coasting through life and everything's hunky-dory, and it only takes that one thing just to trigger off such a devastating impact. And that leads me on to, and I know it's not part of well, I don't think it's part of this suicide prevention strategy, is about those that are left behind, because suicide is a tragedy, sometimes for a small group of people, but very often has a larger effect. I know of somebody who found their friend who'd committed suicide and who had used the hose, the exhaust pipe, and it was 3 days after that they had gone missing that he found them. And that is a vision that lives with him. That happened a long time ago now, lives with him to this day. And he suffered mental health issues based on that, the pressure, the stress that caused on him. And I think it's important that there is some sort of strategy put in place to make sure that not just that we prevent it, because sometimes it's unpreventable, because as we were saying earlier on, you just don't see it coming. But that those that suffer from the acts of that person are there to be protected. It's great to see the stigma about mental health being dealt with by the government. And I congratulate the government, I congratulate them on strategy, and I congratulate them on the work that they've done up to this, because, as has been mentioned by many of the speakers, some of the attacks online, some of the attacks that are made, it used to be that when somebody slagged you, they slagged you to your face, or you'd sometimes get a poison pen letter. You know, what you get now is public ridicule for no reason whatsoever, and you get it from people who you don't even know who they are. So there's nothing you can do. You can't defend yourself against it. So what happens in there is, and you know how people retweet things and they jump on any bandwagon. And what happens then is that this person feels as if they've been assailed from all sides. They feel helpless, feel useless, and that's when they get to the stage. But the important thing that I think is, this strategy will help. It will help in a lot of ways. It won't help in every way, because you can't always tell. I go back to that, where families can look after somebody, the ones that you think that you know, that know you best, and they're the ones who are most shocked when the action, that final action, is taken. I've seen a number of people who have suffered from this. Kevin Stewart talked about earlier on about people coming into the office. In the last 6 months, I've had a number of people coming in who have attempted it, who have talked about attempting it. I had a 17-year-old girl who has tried to kill herself 3 times, and that was 3 times in the space of 6 or 8 weeks. So it's not just us middle-aged and now elderly men who are committing suicide, are attempting to commit suicide. It's that young group who the pressure of life is, they're finding it so difficult. They might be finding it so difficult at a job. They might be finding it so difficult to get that boyfriend or girlfriend that they think that they have to be cool or whatever. That we need to keep in mind that it's the small things that can trigger these huge, huge actions. I welcome the strategy. Everybody has to play their part in this. Everybody has to look at their own family. Everybody has to watch their own friends. And if you see a change in their behaviour, then take note of it. Somebody talked earlier on, I'm not sure if it was Neil Findlay or somebody else, but they talked about the macho thing and about how us Scots are not very good at, us Scots males anyway, are not very good at interacting with each other about our emotions. Sometimes you've got to put that to the side and you've got to just take the chance, and you've got to, if you think somebody doesn't look right, then you've got to ask them the question, you've got to ask them what's wrong, because if you don't, sometimes what happens is that you live to regret not asking them and find it's too late. Okay, thank you.
Many thanks. We now turn to the closing speeches, and I remind members who participated in this debate that they should be in the chamber for closing speeches. I call on Jackson Carlaw with a very generous 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is one of these debates where, as politicians, we contribute wishing that we knew more about the subject, much more about the subject than probably any one of us actually does. And therefore, our contributions are all circumscribed by that fact. I mean, to my surprise, because when we last touched on this, and I can remember the debate quite clearly, it was January the 24th last year when we spoke about mental health issues. I had a thought in my mind that it was much more recently than that, in which there were excellent contributions from many who've not contributed today, from Fiona MacLeod, Malcolm Chisholm, Richard Simpson, Mary Scanlon, Dennis Robertson, Mary Fee and David Stewart. And in that debate, when we were talking about mental health issues more generally, suicide became a feature of our discussion. And at that point, the Sam H. Too Many campaign, which illustrates that even though we are having this discussion and debate against a background of falling numbers of those taking their own lives in Scotland, that Too Many campaign demonstrates that in each and every day there are 2 people in Scotland who are taking their own lives. Now, in total, that's 14 deaths in every 100,000 against a European average of 16 in every 100,000. I think, as Neil Findlay said, roll it all up into a global figure and it's still an astonishing number. It's not the norm, it is the exception. But it is against that background that we are seeking, through the strategy which I think all of us are very happy to support, to effectively understand why and seek to reduce the number further. Now, historically and in different cultures, there are different attitudes to suicide. But here in Scotland, it's a long time since it was a heroic act to defend a nation's well-being in war, or had any correlation to some sort of old imperial Japanese code of conduct. For most people, I have to assume, it is a bleak, cold, lonely decision taken almost always for reasons about which our despair should match that of any unfortunate soul who contemplated such an end. And I think the Minister sums it up in the opening of his strategy document. I mean, against the context, let's understand that we're not going to eliminate suicide. I agree with James Dornan in that, but we should be pursuing policies and actions which will continually mitigate the reasons which drive people to thinking of it. And in the foreword, quite simply at the start, Michael Matheson says, every suicide is a tragedy that has a far-reaching impact on family, friends and the community long after the person has died. And I think that is the general point that every member understands and is at the heart of the tragedy. And during the course of the debate, there were all sorts of reasons advanced. Again, we think, obviously, as Kenny Gibson said and chose not to talk about today, there are those who, faced with some sort of medical prognosis, decide that that is the right course. There are those that are driven by a breakdown in relationships or a radical change in the fortunes of life, and that may very well be relationship-driven, or it could be career, or it could be financial. I think there are those who've been driven to suicide because they are different. And in that, I think, as a country, we can take considerable pride, because we have changed so much as a culture since I was certainly young, when if you were disabled, it was to be something that was the subject of ridicule. If you were gay, it was to be something that was to be disowned, denied, and worse. There were all manner of other social stigmas. We use the word stigma generally, but so many social stigmas that I think drove people to suicide, about which I think as a society at large we have moved considerably, and hopefully not so many apparent. I thought Neil Findlay, who talked about the Touched by Suicide agenda and all the social groups and everything that we can do to assist them to be better able to develop the skills that will allow them to intuitively recognise those that are at risk. I thought Nanette Milne's contribution, which Kevin Stewart and Christine Graham both touched on, about the impact of the web and the potential consequence of that. I mean, I'm not being flippant when I say that my sons certainly received lots of comments for being the sons of a Tory MSP. They've learned to cope with that. But, you know, it is incredible how many young people find upon them bullying driven by the actions of their parents or perceived impressions of their parents, and the wholly corrosive effect that that has on them, and the great reluctance they will have to discuss that in the family, because, of course, they feel in some way they are protecting their parent from what has been said about them. And that, in some dreadful occasions, has driven young people to suicide. Kevin Stewart.
Kevin Stewart.
I understand, and I don't think it's a Westminster myth, that for a great number of years, the sons and daughters of newly elected MPs received a letter from the son of a previous MP about the difficulties that they would face and the pressures that they had because their parent had entered elected politics. And, you know, I think while Mr Carlow's sons are obviously able to cope with this, you know, there are many families who cannot. And I think, you know, this is yet another area where some folks don't realise the damage that they're causing.
Jackson Carlow.
Potentially within what Mr Stewart says is the germ of an idea, way beyond politicians, but it may well be that the children of others who have themselves suffered might very well be a source of information or support to others who then find themselves facing a similar situation. Willie Coffey said that members will know of, and I reflected, because I hadn't until he said that. And then I suddenly realised that my grandmother's sister, of whom I was enormously fond and who had a great influence in bringing me up as an infant, committed suicide. I wasn't told about it till I was in my 30s, in fact. That another relative, I suddenly realised, died in circumstances which I've never been able to determine, which I imagine were suspicious, and were exactly, as Nanette Milne said, of that age and time when it was something nobody wanted to discuss or admit to. And I do also know of friends where a wife committed suicide quite unexpectedly. It was the last person you would have imagined. And the tragedy was that her husband then developed and died from lung cancer and left 3 adopted children. And that is the sort of personal tragedy that people are left with to deal with later on. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I say to the Minister, he obviously enjoys the support of all parties and all members, and the strategy before us is one that we welcome. What I'd like him maybe just to say in his final remarks is how will he ensure that there is an effort, a sustained effort, to give focus to taking forward the commitments and to energise people and to make sure that the results are assessed and that the one-to-one contact and the engagement which underpins much of the strategy he has, together with the practical actions, how he will ensure that that happens, because I think it will obviously be beyond a strategy, but further evidence of that strategy contributing to additional reductions that we will all hope to see progress measured.
Many thanks. Before I move on, I did advise the Chamber that I expect all members who have participated in debates to be present for the closing speeches. I regret to note Graham Pearson is not present and I have not received an explanation. I now call on Rhoda Grant with a generous 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Like many other speakers, I find it difficult to imagine what drives people to suicide, and indeed to imagine the anguish of family members faced by the suicide of a loved one, and therefore welcome the debate because we are taking those issues very seriously, and indeed welcome the impact of the Choose Life strategy, which was published back in 2002. While it's disappointing that the targets have not been fully met, and as Willie Kofi told us, our suicide levels are still much higher than other European averages, we have to take heart that the movement is in the right direction, and therefore I welcome the new strategy following on from Choose Life and hope that it will have similar impacts on the numbers of suicides in our country. A lot of speakers spoke about issues that were very pertinent to this debate, but I think one of them, and maybe one of the more important ones, was that Kevin Stewart mentioned and talked at length about, which is the stigma about mental health. And that's still a stigma up until this day, despite numerous campaigns in this area. How can we encourage people who are desperate, who need help, to go and seek that help and receive it if we don't remove that stigma? And I think that is really important that we do that. Kenny Gibson also mentioned the work of the NUJ in reporting suicide, and I think that is very helpful in that regard as well. A lot of speakers spoke about groups involved in helping people, and I think I would also like to pay tribute to them: Breathing Space, Sam H, Choose Life, Touched by Suicide, and of course the Samaritans, which I think is one of the groups that everyone thinks about when we talk about suicide. They provide a lifeline for those who are suicidal, working round the clock to be there to listen to people. And many of those groups are also working outside the statutory services, which actually makes them more approachable when you look back and look at the stigma and the fear that that puts in people of approaching mental health services. Neil Findlay mentioned the Samaritans Men and Suicide report. And I think that's something we have maybe missed about, how actually maybe it is gender stereotypes that put men at greater risk of suicide, put greater pressure on men to cope, to be strong, to provide greater leadership. And indeed, as James Dornan said, there is an onus on men to have achieved by a certain time in their lives, and they compare themselves maybe with their peers and find themselves wanting. They also have difficulty in discussing their emotions. I think women are much better at discussing emotions and reaching out for help. In men, the gender stereotype says that this is weakness and actually builds barriers for people seeking that help from their peers and their loved ones. We also heard from Neil Findlay and other speakers about the incidence of suicide being much higher in areas of deprivation. And I suppose that shouldn't be surprising, because if you think of people living up in areas of deprivation where they have no hope of improvement, that must eventually grind people down to a point where they see no point in going on. And I think Jim Hume made a really good point when he talked about suicide unequally well. I think we need to look at this as part of health inequalities, because health inequalities takes in so many other health issues, but certainly suicide is one of them when looking at financial pressures and the like. We also need to look at other groups of people. I think it was Nanette Milne that talked about predominantly males in agriculture and in farm workers and farmers themselves indeed. And I think this is a group of people who maybe don't have a lot of social interaction, working in rural areas where they don't meet people. I think it's very important that we reach out to them. And Graham Pearson talked about signposting help for men in kind of male-dominated events, such as sporting events. And I think that is really important. But I think it's also really important that we encourage people to speak about that. Another group is young people, and we all know about issues of transition in mental health services between young people moving from children to adult services, and this is a difficult time. We need to make sure that the services are in place to help them through that. There's also added pressures to young people. I think young people have always been under pressure, but as things move on, especially with social media and the like, the pressures change. And the Young Minds published some research yesterday about the pressures that young people feel that they are facing. Half of them said they felt they had been bullied, which was quite a frightening number of young people. And part of that will, of course, be through the new social medias. And I think Christine Graham as well talked about the difficulty that this caused, and maybe the need for education in this area. But I would also say we need to take that a step further and actually hold those platforms that publish this material to account. And I think if we did that, there would be much more chance that they would police those pages and make sure people didn't come under the pressure of those bullies. And I think that's something we maybe need to look at in the future. Other speakers talked about substance abuse being a trigger for suicide, and I don't think that should surprise us at all, because obviously those who self-medicate, turn to alcohol and drugs for help, are already suffering poor mental health. Therefore, it follows that they are at risk, and we need to look at ways of helping them through that and targeting that group. Graham Pearson talked about the impact of suicide on families, the guilt. Could they have done something? Could they have intervened? And I think families are hugely important to this, because I recently attended a CPG on carers, where families of those who had mental health problems talked about how they, as carers, were treated by psychiatric services, where patients were told not to confide in their families. Families were not given any advice on how to support members coming out of hospital suffering from mental health issues. They weren't told that people coming out of inpatient services were at more risk of suicide, and therefore were ill prepared to help them with that. Yes, of course, patient confidentiality has to be paramount, but when you're actually stopping people reaching out to those that are equipped best to help them, and not providing those families with a knowledge of understanding of what they can do to help, then that surely is not very helpful. Sam H talked in their briefing for the debate, talked about the community support networks they're putting in place, which actually provide support and provide information for people who are caring for those who are suicidal. And I think that is a step in the right direction. They also talked about community engagement, and a lot of people talked about training for people in a work situation that might come up, meet people who were thinking about suicide. But I think if we look at this in a wider community aspect, we can look at suicide prevention and actually look at the training needs throughout our whole society, because we don't know when people will meet someone who is thinking about suicide. And in fact, talking about social media platforms, I was struck by reading a story where someone who was looking to commit suicide was trying to find the person that had intervened. This person wasn't a policeman, a health worker or something, was someone just walking past them who had actually spoken to them, persuaded them not to take their own lives, and then had gone on about their business. They wanted to track that person down because they'd actually changed their lives and actually meant that they hadn't committed suicide, and they wanted to thank them because they didn't think, obviously at a time of great distress, that of taking details or the like. I also welcome that there'll be a self-harm strategy coming out. I think that's important, because those who commit suicide have also, on a lot of occasions, self-harmed. So I think that helps identify those who would commit suicide. Also, if I touch very quickly on the interventions that are available when someone is committing suicide, indeed, and if someone is suffering a mental breakdown, the emergency service that tend to respond tend to be the police, which is not maybe the best response for people in a difficult place. We need to put the services in place that deal with people quickly. There should be no waiting lists in this area, but also deal with them with compassion, reducing the stigma. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, one suicide is one too many, and it's really hard to imagine the despair that leads a person to taking their own life, that leads them to ignore the impact this will have on their family, that leads them to ignore the impact that that will have on the person finding them, and outweighs their natural instinct to prolong their own lives. We wish it wasn't a problem, we wish we weren't debating this, but I think we must do everything possible to support and reach out to those at risk of suicide.
Many thanks. And I now call on Michael Matheson to respond to the debate. Minister, a generous 9 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I say I very much welcome the tone of the debate, and I do appreciate the fact that all members are supporting the motion here tonight, which has become something of a common agenda which has been shared within this chamber over many years now, not just in suicide prevention. It's also been some on the wider mental health agenda as well, and also key points in our drugs policy agenda, where we've been able to get common purpose across the chamber on key social policy areas, which I think is very welcome, and I'm pleased we're able to continue that in this particular debate. I was struck by Graham Pearson's opening remarks when he said he was sad about us having this debate, the sadness of a debate about suicide prevention, for the very reasons that any loss of life through suicide is a tragedy in itself. However, as I said in my opening remarks, a key part of tackling issues around suicide is to talk about it, and is to raise awareness of these issues, and to engage in the matter and in the debate around how we can help to prevent suicide. In my view, as I'm sure Graham Pearson agrees, there is no better way to set that example by the tone and nature of the debate that we can have in our national parliament on this particular matter. And as a Parliament, as Christine Graham said in her remarks, we have had a very strong record over the last 15 years in debating mental health policy issues and that of suicide prevention issues. I have the pleasure to meet delegations from other parts of the world who come to Scotland to look at different policy areas that were taken forward in the health portfolio. We just last week had a team over the Health Minister from Denmark looking at our patient safety programme and what they can learn from that. We've had delegations here to look at our mental health policy, because internationally, believe it or not, Scotland is viewed as being a progressive country in terms of its overall mental health policy and the approach that it's taken over the last 14, 15 years, and also in the area of suicide prevention, because the trend that we have had over the last decade or so of a reducing amount of suicides against a rising amount globally has recognised that Scotland is actually doing some of the right things. And my view as to why that has happened is because I think the Scottish Parliament has allowed devolution to give much greater focus in these things than previously was there. And I think that's to the credit of the Parliament, previous administrations, present administration, all in. I'll give way to the member.
John McAlpine.
Thank the Minister for taking the intervention, and I totally agree with the points that he made about Scotland leading the way in terms of strategies and so on. But in that 10-year period, we've also seen the increase in prescriptions of antidepressants, particularly the new generation of SSI antidepressants. And some people have been critical of that, but perhaps there is a link between the fall in the number of suicides and the fact that people have access to these antidepressants, and those who criticise the prescribing of them might do well to think about that. Minister.
Well, I think the issue of, in any mental health related debate, the issue of the prescribing of antidepressants inevitably does raise itself. And I think it's worth keeping in mind is that medication for the purposes of dealing with a mental health illness is as equally valid as medication for the purposes of someone who is a coronary heart disease problem, or whether they have an arthritis problem. It is a legitimate form of treatment when it's appropriately used. Now, what it would be fair to say is that in recent times there have been changes to prescribing practices around the use of antidepressants, to some extent because of concerns about the way in which individuals were being used or were being provided with them, sometimes for very short periods of time and sometimes for extended periods of time where the clinical evidence wasn't as good in terms of their use. And some of the most recent prescribing data shows that clinicians are inclined to have individuals on antidepressants for a longer period of time at a higher dose, because clinical evidence is now demonstrating that that's a much more effective way to get the benefit of that medication. The net effect is, when the statistics come out, it looks as though there are more people receiving antidepressants for a longer period of time, but it's to reflect the change in prescribing practice. So I think we need to be very careful when we are talking about these things, that we don't give the impression that the use of medicine in the treatment of mental illness is in some way secondary. But I want to also address the issue about access to psychological therapies, because, and I know Jim Hume raised this particular point about we should not limit our ambitions to 18 weeks. It would be fair to say that Scotland is the only part of the UK that has actually set such a target in order to drive up improvement in access to psychological therapies. And it is worth noting that the average time for access to these types of therapies now in Scotland is not 18 weeks. The average time is 9 weeks. And if a patient is in a position where they require an urgent referral to have access to a clinical psychologist or to another type of therapy, then there's a normal process that there is there for the same in referring a patient to see an orthopaedic surgeon, is that you can actually have an urgent referral for that person to be seen much more quickly. But I think equally important in that is that, and there has been an increase in psychologists in Scotland as well within the NHS, but equally there are a range of other therapies there that patients can benefit from. And there's also the mention of the use of physical activity as being an option which can help someone in terms of with their own mental health and well-being. That's why in the mental health strategy we have the social prescribing aspect of it, which is the green pad, the idea that you can be prescribed something which is about physical activity or something else that can help your mental well-being, rather than actually being prescribed medication. And the mental health strategy is looking to encourage that and take it forward. Also, Neil Findlay in his contribution outlined the scale of this issue internationally and the rising problem of suicide across the globe, with between 800,000 to 1 million suicides taking place across the world. And that's why the World Health Organization have set a target by 2020 to reduce suicides by some 10%. And we want to make sure that this strategy helps to play our part and our contribution towards reducing suicides overall. It is worth noting that in 2012, Scotland fell below the world global monthly rate of suicides to 14 per 100,000 against the 16 per 100,000. So we are, again, moving in the right direction, but we have to do more. And I know that Neil Findlay also raised issues around the data which is in the strategy, and also that of the data which he's got from local authorities. The data all comes from the General Registrar of Scotland, which can be broken down into Health Board and to local authority areas. The reason that there are some differences in it is because in 2010, the World Health Organization issued guidance which resulted in a change to the coding of particular deaths, which meant that there were some drug deaths which are now included in the group which is classed as suicide. However, the GRO in Scotland still produces the two separate sets of data, one with the new coding and one with the old coding, which shows that 18% reduction. So that's why there is a difference in the data which he refers to. But the data which has been it's been measured against is the data that was collected over the 10-year period of the Choose Life programme, which was prior to the change that was introduced by the GRO after the World Health Organization recommendations. Now, a number of members have also made reference to the impact that suicide can have on families, and I'm struck by the number of, and I'm not surprised, sadly, by the number of members who have all had been touched in some way by a suicide through a family member or a friend. In my opening comments, I made a point which I think is extremely important here, and that is that suicide is preventable. And the ScotSID data shows us very clearly that the vast majority of those individuals who do commit suicide were either receiving treatment in the form of medication for a mental illness, or have been in contact with GPs, A&E departments or other services prior to the time when they commit suicide. And what is absolutely, if I can just finish this point first of all, what is absolutely key here is that we learn from the fact that if these individuals are in contact with these services, why are we not picking up on the potential risk of those individuals committing a suicide? And some of the work which we're doing as part of the pilot work up at Tayside is to look at how we can much more effectively make sure that if the person presents in distress at the A&E department but doesn't need to be admitted, if they're arrested by the police and they're in distress or other agencies, how we respond to that much more effectively to follow that individual up. And that's why in the self-harm strategy there's an important piece of work for us to take forward there, and how we can be much more effective at picking up on these signs of distress, which is one of the key factors that can often present itself in actually demonstrating that someone may be at risk of committing suicide. Do I have time to take this intervention?
I can give you 2 more minutes or so. Christine
Graham. Simply on, because some of us said, of course, many of these suicides, or some of the suicides, they are not detectable, they come out of the blue. But on the issue of it being preventable, can I ask the Minister to address, in case he runs out of time, social media and educating, which I raised and others, educating children and young people about the responsibilities in that, because we could have avoided perhaps some young suicides had there been some discipline in the use of it.
Minister.
Yeah, I understand the point that Christine Graham was making, that not all suicides are, there are not always signs of distress prior to someone committing suicide. However, the evidence shows us that a very large number do. And what we need to do is make sure we get much better at making sure that we identify these individuals more effectively and to follow them up more effectively. Now, the issue of cyberbullying, etc., and social media, etc., Kevin Stewart raised the benefits that can be used in terms of social media in addressing stigma issues, and also in educating and informing individuals about services and supports that are available, but also the negative side that the member made as well, and that is around how people can use it in a negative way, and I'm sure we've all witnessed examples of that in itself. I know there are programmes in schools which is there to the Respect programme, which is about respecting individuals in the use of social media. And it's important that we continue to take that forward. And I've got no doubt that my colleagues in the education side will continue to take that type of policy forward. And I'll certainly make sure that as we go forward with the self-harm strategy work, we'll look at how we can help to make sure we build more of that into the approach that we take around how cyberbullying, etc., can have an impact on someone's mental well-being. Presiding Officer, just in drawing my remarks to a close, a number of members asked how we are going to take this forward. I'm not a fan, I should say, of big, thick strategies. I like strategies which are task-focused and for a limited period of time that you can measure against. Hence, the short nature of this particular strategy from my own perspective. We are bringing in an implementation group which will be made up of a range of individuals from across the sector who will be responsible for measuring and monitoring the implementation of their living commitments within this strategy. I've also limited it to being a 3-year strategy so that it's focused and that we can measure it over that given period of time to evaluate its progress. And I want to reassure members that there will be no lack of energy on my part to drive it forward. And I've got no doubt that the Monitoring Implementation Group will hold us to account in making sure that we're doing that effectively across all of the agencies and all of those who have a part to play. Presiding Officer, I'm very grateful for all of the positive comments that have been made in this debate here today, and I will, of course, continue to keep the Chamber informed of progress we make in taking the strategy forward.
Many thanks, and that concludes the debate on suicide prevention. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 8734, in the name of John Lamont, on the City of Edinburgh Council Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill. Can I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on John Lamont to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the City of Edinburgh Council Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill. Committee, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am pleased to open the preliminary stage debate for the City of Edinburgh Council Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill, and to provide the Parliament with some background on how the committee has considered this bill so far. This is the fourth private bill that has come before the Parliament this session, and I have to say it is one of the less controversial, with no objections to the bill having been received. The first thing that struck me about the bill when the committee was given the task of scrutinising it was its rather unwieldy title. It wasn't long before I appreciated that although this is one bill, it deals with two different and unconnected purposes. So although it is fair to say that it is not a controversial bill, it is still given the committee plenty of substance to consider, as well as making ourselves with rather unique procedures concerned with this important area of the Parliament's work. Before I provide some background information on what led to this bill and talk about its broad principles, I would like to speak briefly about private bills more generally and why they are necessary. Private bills propose laws which allow individuals, groups of individuals or corporate entities to acquire powers or benefits in excess of or in conflict with the general law. Large-scale works, private bills, are somewhat rarer these days, but the Parliament still sees a steady stream of governance reorganisation bills and the occasional bill seeking to make changes to private legislation to enable construction to take place. Unusually, the bill we are debating today deals with both of these issues, the common denominator being the promoter, City of Edinburgh Council. The first objective of the bill is to amend Section 22 of the Schedule to the City of Edinburgh District Council Order Confirmation Act 1991, so that the erection of a statue of John Rattray on Leith Links is no longer prohibited. Currently, Section 22 prohibits the erection of buildings, including monuments or statues, on Leith Links. But you might ask, Deputy Presiding Officer, who is John Rattray and why should he be commemorated in this way? Well, John Rattray was an accomplished golfer on the Leith Links in the 18th century. He was instrumental in setting down the rules for the game of golf, and for this reason the Leith Rules Golf Society wished to erect a life-size statue of him on Leith Links. Pat Densler, chair of the Statue Committee, described in evidence that was as the aim to provide something iconic to represent Leith. The sculptor, David Anad, has been commissioned to create this statue, and I'm sure members will be acquainted with his work, particularly as one of his bronze statues resides not too far from this chamber, that of Robert Ferguson, the poet striding out at the entrance to the Canongate Church. The committee was concerned with ensuring that the power sought was indeed necessary and that there would be no unintended consequences arising from the use of the power. We were clear that the issues of aesthetics and security of the statue had already been subject to the planning process, with planning permission being granted on the 18th of April 2013 on the basis that the proposals comply with the Council's development plan and the relevant non-statutory guidelines and would preserve the character and appearance of the conservation area and have no effect on residential amenity. Our site visit to Leith Links on the 5th of November 2013 further served to reassure us. The committee is therefore satisfied that the bill is tightly drawn to create an exception only for this particular statue and that no further development can take place on the site at Leith Links. Fundraising to erect the statue is continuing, and the Golf Society hope that the Ryder Cup will help focus these efforts. The committee also heard that a proportion of the funds raised will be given to the promoter to pay for the statue's ongoing maintenance. Turning to the second objective of the bill, which concerns the revitalisation of a fund set up to assist those caught up by a series of fires on Edinburgh High Street in 1824. The Surplus Fire Fund is constituted under the Edinburgh Corporation Order Confirmation Act 1927 and later amended by the Council's 1967 and 1991 Order Confirmation Acts. Esmond Hamilton from the City of Edinburgh Council explained that £11,000 had been collated originally to assist those caught up in the fires and that this had grown to the sum of £1.25 million, generating approximately £30,000 per annum. The Surplus Fire Fund lay dormant until 2001 when the Fire Brigade Union contacted the City of Edinburgh Council, which led to its reactivisation. The Council's Pensions and Trust Committee discussed the future management of the fund during 2011 and 2012.
Final minute.
Considering how its assets might be put to better use, having regard to the spirit of the fund's current purposes, changes in societies, the effectiveness of its present constitution and engagement with key stakeholders. The full Council agreed on the 31st of January 2013 to promote the bill, which included 3 changes to the fund, namely to transfer the assets, rights, liabilities of the Surplus Fire Fund to the Edinburgh Voluntary Organisation Trust, secondly to amend the purposes for which the fund can be used, and then thirdly to dissolve the fund as currently constituted. The committee heard from Ella Simpson, the Director of the Edinburgh Voluntary Organisations Council, about its experience of running various grant programmes and several restricted funds, and its large network of organisations which could prefer possible beneficiaries of the fund.
Afraid you must draw to a close, please.
In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, based on evidence the committee has received, we are supportive of the objectives of the bill, and that as a private bill is the necessary way and appropriate way to take this forward. I am grateful to my fellow committee members for their hard work and indeed for the clerks for their work in connection with this bill. I move the motion in my name. Thank you.
Many thanks. I have 2 members who wish to participate in the open debate. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. I call Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Anne McTaggart.
Presiding Officer, I am very pleased to support this bill in its totality, although clearly I have a particular interest in the first part as the local member for Leith Links. I believe that this bill does have local support, as evidenced by the community councils locally and other groups and individuals supporting it. The only concern I have occasionally heard is when people think it may be taking out public funds, but clearly this is not involving that, but fundraising by the Leith Rules Golf Society. There is a great sense of history in Leith. We obviously have a very rich and varied history, and there is a great campaign ongoing for a Leith museum, which no doubt I shall speak about in the Parliament on another occasion. But part of that history is the significance of golf on Leith Links. It was certainly one of the first places where golf was played. I don't want to enter the arguments of exactly where was the first place, but what is indisputable is that the rules of golf were first written down by those playing golf on Leith Links. Indeed, the City of Edinburgh Council, who are the promoters of the bill, offered a silver club to the winner of a golf competition in Leith Links in the 1740s on the condition that the rules were written down. And I'm very pleased that the rules were written down on the 7th of March 1744, which is my birthday, well, the 7th of March bit of it anyway. So I think it is very appropriate that a statue is put up to John Rattray, because he won that particular trophy on 3 occasions and was also a very colourful character, being a surgeon, an archer and a Jacobite, as well as a very distinguished golfer. So I think it's very fitting that his statue should be put up on Leith Links as quickly as possible. And of course this is very timely, because there is going to be a heightened interest in golf in Scotland this year because of the Ryder Cup, and I hope that that will provide a boost to the fundraising for the statue. Now, it's quite clear for the reasons that John Lamont has explained that a bill was required to change the law in this regard. I know explaining this to people has provided a great deal of amusement as well as interest, but that is in the nature of some private bills. When it comes to the Surplus Fire Fund, I think it wasn't quite so clear that a bill was required. In fact, I was rather alarmed to read that the drafting of Section 42 of the 2005 Charities Act was ambiguous and its interpretation difficult. Apparently, Oscar thought that legislation was not required, but the City of Edinburgh Council decided that it would play safe and ensure that nobody could challenge the way in which they wanted to broaden the scope of the purposes of the Surplus Fire Fund in order to attract more applications for grants and awards. And I certainly support that objective. The reason I was disturbed, of course, by the comment about Section 42 of the 2005 Act was that the people responsible for that Act were Joanne Lamont and myself, and I was amazed to think that we should be in any way connected with defective legislation. But that apart, I would like to commend the committee for its very, very detailed and conscientious examination of this bill. I read their report and the evidence session, and I thought that every single nook and cranny, as it were, of this legislation was interrogated by the committee, and I'm pleased that the next speaker is going to be one of those distinguished interrogators, Anne McTaggart.
Many thanks, and I now call Anne McTaggart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member, as clearly illustrated there, as a member of the City of Edinburgh Council, Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill Committee, I am pleased to contribute briefly to the debate, which I am sure is an issue important to the local community. As part of my role as a member of the committee, I have gained valuable insight into an important and historical local issue that necessitates full consultation prior to any recommendation. I feel that this debate has illustrated the vital role that the Leith Links has played in the life of the local community, and I believe that all those have an interest in the area should be consulted before any decision is made. That is why, Presiding Officer, I have very much enjoyed being a member of the committee, in particular the opportunity it has given me to visit this, what is to local residents, an important site. I am happy to support the installation of the John Rattray statue, especially as the local community have been involved in a consultation process, such as with the potential effects of tourism to the local area through people visiting the statue site once it has been installed. I am particularly pleased to note the proposed artwork in the local area should highlight the valuable role public consultation played in this Leith-based initiative. The consultation process afforded the opportunity...
Sorry, can I stop you a moment? I'm afraid that the chatting meant the member thought there was an intervention request, so Anne McTaggart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The consultation process afforded the opportunity to seek guidance from Police Scotland, and if this proposal was to go ahead, the police indicated that the initial plans they viewed as being vulnerable, and consideration should be given to the possibility of installing public space monitored CCTV and other measures to ensure the site was safe and secure. However, the committee had been informed that the plan had been changed, lessening such risks and taking such concerns into account. Although it is important that consideration should be given to ensuring that any statue to be installed on the site should meet all the necessary requirements of safe installation, including ongoing health and safety requirements. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I am pleased to support this initiative, which will provide an additional structure which will enhance the landscape of the local area. And lastly, Presiding Officer, to thank the committee convener, John Lamont, for his outstanding patience and guidance throughout the process, and the committee clerk, Claire Menzies-Smith, for her patience and guidance also. Thank you.
Many thanks. And I now invite Sandra White to wind up the debate on behalf of the committee, and you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. May I thank the convener for his very informative contribution. Over 6 minutes, I congratulate John Lamont. It was very informative, and I'm sure that most of the people here, members in the chamber, actually found it very, very interesting also. Can I also thank Malcolm Chisholm, who obviously mentioned he is the local member, for the very much welcome local knowledge that you put forward, Mr Chisholm. I found that very interesting. I'm sure that members of the Parliament will find it very interesting also. And my fellow committee member, Anne McTaggart, for her comments and her work on the committee. I think it was very noticeable when we went to visit the Leith Links area with the committee and the clerks also, that great detail and attention was put forward in regards to exactly where the statue would be erected, that it wasn't basically in front of anyone's windows, or it didn't disturb anyone. And certainly, as Malcolm Chisholm has mentioned also, the local community councils certainly were very supportive of the overall aspects of the bill. If I could just go forward, convener, into sort of an introduction of the part that I want to cover within my remarks as the Deputy Convener. I am very pleased to be closing this debate for the committee today, and I would like to thank, and I think it's already been mentioned, but firstly I would like to thank all those who have contributed to the scrutiny of this bill so far, all members who were there, not just by providing oral and written evidence, as we had put forward by the people who were proposing the statute and the bill, but from everyone who wrote in as well and gave their thoughts on it, from the police to various other local people within the community. And I must also thank the clerks to the committee for their assistance. It was most welcome, having never sat on a private bill before. I found it very interesting, and the convener has explained the differences of why private bills have to come through Parliament in this way. So very much an honour to be Deputy Convener of the committee. As I said, it was my very first time, and sure, maybe again I may be called forward, but I'm always happy to do my duty, as most of the MSPs here obviously are. If I could just touch on the Leith Links issue, and I mentioned earlier on in my opening remarks about having visited the area with the committee and the members previously. I do believe that the statue will be an attractive addition to the Leith Links. The statue will promote awareness of the rich history, as Malcolm Chisholm has already mentioned, about the golfing on the links. And through this, I think the community of Leith will benefit, as not just the statue will attract people there, but the relevant historic connections to the statue as well. And I think that people who come along to visit, and I do think that Anne McTaggart had mentioned this previously, people who come along to visit will also look at the other facilities and use the businesses in the area, and that can only be a good thing. I want to go on to the Surplus Fire Fund. The bill will certainly revitalise what had become a dormant fund. The changes to the purposes for which the fund can be applied will improve its use by encouraging more applications from individuals affected by fire than have been applying. Is that okay to continue?
Please do. If you could continue until 5 o'clock, I'd be most grateful.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I just wondered if that was all right. I mean, I'm not one for complaining, but I couldn't hear myself speak there. And I think, regarding the Surplus Fire Fund, it's really, really important that people realise that this has been a dormant fund, and it will open up to so many more people. And that's why I wanted to encourage people to listen to these particular points. Obviously, it will encourage more applications from individuals affected by fire than have been applying, because their injuries will no longer be deemed to be serious, allowing claims for damage to domestic premises and household contents, where in many cases those applying, this is really important, those applying will not be insured. It's very, very helpful in that respect. It will expressively allowing provisions of the grants to burn units caring for people resident in the City of Edinburgh Council areas. It's very important, these three particular points. I would like to now go on to the transfer of the fund to EVOC, which will enable them to refer organisations within the large network that they work with to the fund, which EVOC believe will have a cumulative impact on other charitable organisations and individuals. And I think that's an important point also. And also make use of the wide experience of the trustees within EVOC in ensuring that the fund is used to its very best effects. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I believe that both purposes of this bill will provide benefits to the community, and on behalf of the committee, I recommend to Parliament that the general principles of the bill be passed. I think, yes, Stuart?
Certainly.
I know that the member is a visitor to Leith Links, because I remember bumping into her at the fun fair at the Leith Festival last year. So this will obviously be a very welcome development for people who live in Leith, but does she think that people from Glasgow like herself or further afield will now visit Leith Links to see this statue as well as to attend the fun fair?
Ms White.
A very welcome intervention. I did, in fact, meet Mr Chisholm on the Leith Links at the fun fair when I had my granddaughter, and Mr Chisholm also had a granddaughter also. And certainly there's lots of things take place on the links, and as someone coming from Glasgow visiting Edinburgh, I'll certainly make my way down there to the links. I know exactly where the statue is now, and I think one of the great things about where the statue is going to be built, it's it's going to be quite an iconic statue, but it won't be something that is out of place within the links, and it will certainly encourage people down there. And I hope by encouraging people to come down there, perhaps people like me or even younger people might take up golf, who knows? But just by reading about it and seeing the historic connections there, I think it's a great idea, and I look forward to, once again, perhaps bumping into Mr Chisholm and his granddaughter in the Leith Links and maybe have a chat and perhaps a game of golf as well. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Our thanks are due to you, Ms White. That concludes the debate on the City of Edinburgh Council, Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund. We now move to the next item of business, which is the consideration of a business motion number 8812 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a revision to the business programme for tomorrow, Wednesday the 22nd of January 2014. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8812. No members asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8812 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is decision time, to which we now come. The first question is that motion number 8577 in the name of Joan McAlpine on the Burrell-Collection, Lending and Borrowing Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8800 in the name of Michael Matheson on suicide prevention be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8734 in the name of John Lamont on the City of Edinburgh Council, Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Any members who are leaving the chamber should do so now quickly and quietly.